The institution of slavery in England emerged from the complex intersection of Roman imperial administration, indigenous British social structures, and the fundamental economic realities that shaped ancient European civilization. The arrival of Roman legions under the command of Emperor Claudius in 43 CE marked the beginning of a transformation that would introduce systematic slaveholding practices to the British Isles, though the indigenous populations had already maintained their own forms of unfree labour that predated Roman conquest by centuries. The Celtic tribes that inhabited the regions, later known as England, possessed social hierarchies that included various categories of dependent labourers, whose status ranged from temporary bondage for debt to permanent hereditary servitude. Archaeological evidence from Iron Age settlements throughout what would become England reveals the material conditions of these early social distinctions, with excavations at sites like Danebury and Maiden Castle uncovering dwelling structures that suggest clear differentiation between elite residences and the cramped quarters that housed subordinate populations. The Celtic term for these unfree individuals varied across tribal groups, but the fundamental relationship involved persons who lacked the legal protections and social standing accorded to free members of the community, their labour and persons subject to the authority of masters who exercised control over virtually every aspect of their existence. The Roman conquest transformed these indigenous practices through the introduction of legal frameworks and economic systems that had been refined through centuries of Mediterranean slaveholding. The Romans brought with them a fully developed ideology of slavery that categorized certain human beings as property, subject to purchase, sale, and inheritance according to principles that treated them as fundamentally different from free persons. The legal concept of the slave as res, a thing rather than a person, represented a philosophical and juridical innovation that distinguished Roman slavery from the more fluid forms of dependency that had characterized pre-conquest British society. The establishment of Roman administrative centers throughout Britannia created urban markets, where slaves were bought and sold according to procedures that followed imperial legal codes, with officials maintaining records of transactions that documented the transfer of human property between owners. The city of Londinium, founded shortly after the conquest near a strategic crossing point of the Thames River, developed into the province's primary commercial hub, where slave markets operated alongside the trade in grain, pottery, metalwork, and other commodities essential to urban life. Archaeological investigations at Roman London have revealed the physical infrastructure of these markets, including the remains of buildings that served as holding facilities for slaves awaiting sale, and the artifacts associated with the identification and control of enslaved persons. The iron collars discovered at various Romano-British sites, inscribed with owners' names and instructions for the return of runaways, provide material evidence of the mechanisms through which slaveholders maintained authority over their human property. The economic foundations of Romano-British slavery rested primarily on agricultural production in the villa estates that spread across the southeastern lowlands during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. These rural establishments combined residential complexes for wealthy landowners with extensive farming operations that required substantial labor forces to cultivate grain, tend livestock, and maintain the elaborate facilities that characterized the most developed villa sites. Excavations at locations such as Fishbourne Palace and Bignor Villa have revealed the architectural sophistication of these establishments, with their heated bath complexes, mosaic floors, and elaborately decorated reception rooms, serving as visible manifestations of the wealth generated through agricultural exploitation. The labor forces that sustained these estates included both free tenants and enslaved workers, with the proportion varying according to regional conditions and individual estate management practices. The slaves who worked Romano-British agricultural estates performed the full range of tasks necessary for large-scale farming operations, from the heavy labor of field preparation and harvest to the specialized skills required for viticulture, olive cultivation in southern regions, and the production of processed foods. The villas that achieved the highest levels of production employed skilled craftsmen who were themselves often slaves. Their expertise in metalworking, pottery manufacture, textile production, and construction representing valuable assets that increase their market value while intensifying their bondage. The training of young slaves in specialized crafts created economic incentives for masters to maintain stable workforces, rather than relying on constant replacement through market purchases, leading to the development of estate-based slave populations that reproduce themselves through natural increase. The urban centers of Roman Britain employed substantial slave populations in household service, commercial enterprises, and the skilled trades that supplied the manufactured goods consumed by provincial elites and military personnel. The archaeological record from towns like Verulamium, Cirencester, and York reveals the material culture of urban slavery through the discovery of artifacts associated with domestic service, including the specialized tools and equipment used in food preparation, textile work, and the maintenance of the heated bath facilities that wealthy households considered essential amenities. The inscriptions found on tombstones and memorial tablets occasionally document the lives of individual slaves and freed persons, providing glimpses into the human experiences that lay behind the impersonal legal categories and economic calculations that defined their status. The epitaph of a Greek slave physician who practiced in Roman London demonstrates the complex patterns of cultural interaction and social mobility that characterized urban slavery, as educated slaves from the Eastern Mediterranean brought specialized knowledge that commanded respect, even while their legal status as property denied them fundamental human rights. The mining operations that extracted lead, silver, tin, and iron from British deposits relied heavily on enslaved labor to perform the dangerous and exhausting work of ore extraction and processing. The lead mines of the Mendip Hills and Derbyshire, which produced metal essential for water pipes, roofing materials, and various manufactured goods, employed convict laborers alongside slaves in conditions that represented some of the harshest forms of exploitation in the Roman world. The stamped lead ingots, discovered at mine sites and in shipwrecks off the British coast, bear inscriptions that document imperial ownership and management of these extractive operations, indicating that at least some mining slaves were the property of the Roman state rather than private individuals. The mortality rates among mine workers were extraordinarily high due to the combination of physical dangers, exposure to toxic materials, and the inadequate nutrition that characterized the provisioning of workers whose replacement cost less than maintaining them in conditions that would preserve their health and strength. The legal framework governing slavery in Roman Britain derived from the extensive body of Roman law that had developed over centuries of imperial expansion, and that treated slavery as a fundamental institution, requiring detailed regulation to maintain social order and protect property rights. The provincial administration in Britannia enforced legal codes that defined the rights of slaveholders, the procedures for manumission that could grant freedom to enslaved persons, and the criminal penalties applicable to slaves who committed offences against their masters or the broader community. The Romano-British court system heard cases involving slaves as both perpetrators and victims of crimes, though the legal protections afforded to enslaved persons were minimal and heavily weighted toward preserving the authority of masters over their human property. The testimony of slaves in legal proceedings was generally inadmissible unless extracted through torture, a procedural requirement that reflected the Roman assumption that persons in servile condition could not be trusted to tell the truth without physical coercion to overcome their natural inclination to protect their own interests. The practice of manumission, through which slaves could obtain legal freedom and some degree of social mobility, operated according to formal procedures that required masters to make public declarations of their intent to free specific individuals, with the freed persons acquiring a new legal status that remained distinct from that of freeborn citizens. The freed slaves, known as liberty, maintained ongoing obligations to their former masters that included continued service, financial payments, and political support, creating patron-client relationships that extended the social hierarchy beyond the formal boundary between slavery and freedom. The children of freed persons generally enjoyed fuller legal rights than their parents, allowing for gradual social advancement across generations. Though the stigma of servile ancestry could persist for extended periods and affect opportunities for marriage, political participation, and social acceptance. The economic calculations that influenced decisions about manumission involved consideration of the slave's age, skills, and productive capacity, with masters most likely to free individuals whose best years of labor had passed or whose specialized abilities made them valuable, as independent operators who would remain in economic relationships with their former owners. The provision in Roman law that allowed slaves to accumulate property, known as peculium, created pathways through which some enslaved persons could purchase their own freedom, though the amounts required were substantial and achievable only for those who possessed marketable skills or who served in positions that provided opportunities for independent earnings. The military forces stationed in Roman Britain included soldiers who owned slaves as personal servants and camp followers who performed various support functions for the legions and auxiliary units that garrisoned the province. The archaeological evidence from military sites along Hadrian's Wall and at the legionary fortresses of Chester, York, and Caerleon reveals the presence of enslaved persons who served officers, worked in military workshops producing equipment and supplies, and provided domestic labor for the communities that developed around permanent military installations. The slaves associated with military establishments enjoyed certain advantages over their agricultural counterparts, including access to better nutrition from military supply systems, opportunities to acquire skills in metalworking and other military-related crafts, and possibilities for social advancement through relationships with military personnel, who might eventually grant manumission as rewards for faithful service. The military slaves who served officers in personal capacities sometimes achieved positions of significant responsibility, managing their master's financial affairs, supervising other slaves and free workers, and representing military interests in dealings with civilian authorities. The end of effective Roman authority in Britain during the early 5th century CE created profound disruptions in the social and economic systems that had sustained slavery in its Roman legal forms, though the institution continued in modified forms that adapted to the changing political landscape. The withdrawal of Roman military forces beginning around 410 CE left provincial populations to defend themselves against increasing pressure from Saxon raiders and internal conflicts between competing Romano-British leaders who struggled to maintain order in the absence of imperial administration. The breakdown of urban centres and the villa system that had formed the economic foundation of Romano-British society eliminated many of the structures through which slavery had been regulated and maintained, forcing adaptations that drew on both Roman precedents and Germanic practices introduced by Anglo-Saxon settlers. The collapse of the monetary economy and the disruption of trade networks that had connected Britain to the broader Mediterranean world transformed slavery from a commercial institution involving market transactions into a more personalized system of household bondage that operated within the context of warrior bands and emerging Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon invasions and settlements that reshaped England between the 5th and 7th centuries CE brought populations whose customary laws recognized several categories of unfree persons, distinguished by varying degrees of dependency and different pathways into servile status. The Germanic legal traditions that the Anglo-Saxons carried with them from their continental homelands included concepts of slavery that differed in important respects from Roman practices, though both systems shared fundamental assumptions about the legitimacy of holding human beings as property. The Anglo-Saxon term, theau, designated a person in complete servile condition, lacking legal personality and subject to the absolute authority of a master who could sell, punish, or kill them with minimal legal constraint. The esne represented another category of agricultural labourer whose status fell below that of free peasants, but who possessed more secure tenure and greater legal protections than theaus, creating a gradation of unfree conditions that reflected the complex social hierarchies of early medieval England. The laws promulgated by Anglo-Saxon kings beginning in the late 6th century, with the Code of Athelbert of Kent, reveal the central importance of slavery within the social and economic organization of the emerging English kingdoms. These legal texts specified the compensation due to masters for injuries inflicted on their slaves by third parties, the penalties for slaves who committed crimes against free persons, and the procedures through which individuals could fall into slavery or achieve freedom. The monetary values assigned to slaves in these law codes provide evidence of their economic importance, with skilled slaves commanding prices that reflected their productive capacity, while young children and elderly persons had lower valuations based on their limited utility to purchasers. The legal distinction between slaves and free persons was maintained through strict rules governing marriage, inheritance, and social interaction, with unions between free and enslaved persons typically resulting in the reduction of the free party to servile status or the illegitimacy of any children produced by such relationships. The sources of slavery in Anglo-Saxon England included capture in warfare, judicial punishment for crimes, voluntary self-sale in times of famine or economic desperation, birth to enslaved parents, and failure to meet debt obligations. The military conflicts that characterized the Anglo-Saxon settlement period and the subsequent wars between competing kingdoms generated continuous supplies of captives who were either retained as slaves by their captors or sold in dynacenta, markets that developed in urban centers and at periodic gathering places. The enslavement of defeated enemies represented both an economic benefit that compensated victorious warriors for their military service and a method of social control that removed potential threats while extracting labor value from epicide, subject populations. The extensive slave raiding that Anglo-Saxon warriors conducted against Celtic populations in Wales, Cornwall, and the northern regions provided particularly important sources of captive labor, with contemporary accounts describing expeditions whose primary purpose was the acquisition of slaves rather than territorial conquest or political subjugation. The voluntary entry into slavery, while seemingly paradoxical to modern sensibilities, represented a survival strategy for individuals and families facing starvation during harvest failures or other economic catastrophes that threatened their existence. The Anglo-Saxon laws that permitted free persons to sell themselves or their children into slavery recognized the harsh realities of subsistence agriculture in a society that lacked effective mechanisms for social welfare or famine relief. The legal procedures governing such transactions required public witnesses and formal declarations to prevent fraudulent enslavement of free persons, though the protections were limited and enforcement depended on the vigilance of kinship groups who might challenge questionable claims of voluntary servitude. The practice of selling family members into temporary or permanent bondage created profound social tensions that literary sources occasionally reference, with surviving documents revealing the anguish of parents forced to choose between watching their children starve and surrendering them to lives of servitude. The agricultural economy of Anglo-Saxon England relied heavily on the labour of the Ows and Esnes, who worked the estates of kings, nobles, and ecclesiastical institutions that controlled the most productive lands. The great estates that formed the basis of aristocratic wealth required substantial workforces to cultivate grains, tend livestock, maintain buildings and equipment, and produce the range of goods necessary for the largely self-sufficient economic units that characterized early medieval agriculture. The organization of estate labor varied according to local conditions and management practices, with some properties maintaining dedicated slave populations housed in separate quarters, and others integrating unfree workers into broader household arrangements that included free servants and family members. The most detailed evidence for estate organization comes from documents produced by monastic institutions that describe the dues, services, and conditions associated with different categories of workers, revealing the complex arrangements through which religious houses extracted labor and agricultural produce from the populations settled on their lands. The daily experiences of enslaved agricultural workers involved the full range of farming tasks required by the seasonal cycles of medieval cultivation, from the winter work of preparing fields and maintaining equipment through the intense labor demands of spring planting and autumn harvest. The Thaos who performed field labor worked under the supervision of estate managers who allocated tasks, enforced discipline, and ensured that agricultural schedules were maintained according to the requirements of successful farming. The lack of personal autonomy that defined slave status extended beyond labor obligations to encompass restrictions on movement, marriage, and family life, with masters exercising control over virtually every aspect of daily existence. The housing provided to agricultural slaves typically consisted of simple structures that offered minimal protection from weather and little privacy, with material conditions that stood in stark contrast to the substantial halls and well-appointed dwellings occupied by free persons of even modest means. The archaeological investigation of Anglo-Saxon settlement sites has revealed physical evidence of the differential living conditions that marked social hierarchies, with excavations at locations like West Stow and Mucking uncovering structural remains that suggest clear distinctions between elite residences and the smaller, less well-constructed buildings that housed dependent populations. The diet available to enslaved workers was sufficient to maintain their labor capacity, but lacked the variety and quantity available to free persons, with provisions consisting primarily of bread, pottage made from grain and vegetables, and occasional supplements of cheese or salted meat. The nutritional deficiencies evident in skeletal remains from early medieval cemeteries provide physical evidence of the hardships endured by lower status individuals, with bone analysis revealing patterns of disease and growth disruption that correlate with inadequate nutrition during childhood and ongoing dietary insufficiency throughout adult life. The distribution of grave goods in Anglo-Saxon burial sites suggests that even in death, the social distinctions of the living continue to operate, with enslaved persons receiving minimal burial treatment that contrasted with the elaborate furnished graves provided to individuals of free status. The ecclesiastical institutions that emerged as major landholders in Anglo-Saxon England maintained substantial slave populations to work their estates and perform the various tasks necessary for monastic communities. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity during the 7th century introduced religious authorities who brought with them complex attitudes towards slavery that acknowledged its economic necessity, while occasionally expressing discomfort with the institution's harsher aspects. The early medieval church did not challenge the fundamental legitimacy of slavery, but instead focused on regulating the treatment of enslaved Christians and encouraging manumission as an act of piety that could benefit the souls of both masters and freed persons. The monastic houses that spread across England, following the Augustinian mission of 597 CE, acquired extensive landholdings through royal grants and pious donations, developing into economic enterprises that required large labor forces to exploit their agricultural resources. The slaves who worked monastic estates performed the same agricultural tasks as their counterparts on secular properties, but they also contributed to the specialized production activities that monastic communities developed, including the copying of manuscripts, the brewing of ale, the baking of bread, and the manufacture of textiles. The question of whether Christianity improved the conditions of enslaved persons in Anglo-Saxon England admits of no simple answer, as the evidence reveals a complex and often contradictory relationship between religious teachings and actual practices. The theoretical position articulated by church authorities emphasized the spiritual equality of all Christians before God, while maintaining that earthly social hierarchies reflected divine will and should not be disrupted by appeals to religious principles. The writings of early medieval theologians addressed the apparent paradox through elaborate arguments that distinguished between spiritual freedom in Christ and the temporal bondage that resulted from human sin and the fallen nature of his exodacia, earthly existence. The practical effect of church teachings was to encourage masters to treat their slaves with a degree of mercy and to acknowledge obligations that transcended purely economic calculations, though these moral suasions lacked enforcement mechanisms and depended entirely on the personal piety and character of individual slaveholders. The manumission of slaves became an act of Christian charity that wealthy individuals performed as demonstrations of piety and as spiritual investments that would benefit their souls in the afterlife. The surviving documents recording such freedoms reveal various motivations and conditions, with some manumissions granted unconditionally as deathbed bequests, while others imposed continuing obligations on freed persons that maintained them in economic dependency. The practice of freeing slaves at church altars in ceremonies that invoke divine witness represented attempts to give manumission religious sanction, while creating public records that would prevent future challenges to the freed person's status. The involvement of ecclesiastical authorities in manumission procedures reflected the Church's role as a guarantor of social order and a keeper of records in a society where written documentation remained relatively scarce. literacy was largely confined to religious institutions. The Norse raids that began devastating coastal regions of England in the late 8th century introduced new dynamics into English slavery through the Vikings' extensive involvement in slave trading and their establishment of major commercial networks that distributed captives throughout northern Europe and beyond. The attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 CE marked the beginning of a period of sustained Viking activity that would fundamentally reshape English society and create massive demand for slaves who could be sold in Scandinavian markets or transported to distant regions. The Norse raiders who descended on English shores sought not only the precious metals and religious artifacts that monasteries and wealthy estates contained, but also the human captives who represented portable wealth that could be easily transported and readily converted to profit. The establishment of Viking settlements in eastern and northern England during the 9th century, the region that came to be known as the Danelaw, created permanent Scandinavian populations whose cultural practices and legal traditions influenced English slavery in significant ways. The Scandinavian legal codes that operated in the Danelaw recognized categories of unfree persons that roughly corresponded to Anglo-Saxon classifications, but that included distinctions reflecting Norse social organization and economic practices. The thrall, the Norse equivalent of the Yao, occupied the lowest rung of the social hierarchy and performed the agricultural labor and domestic service that sustained Viking settlements. The extensive contact between English and Scandinavian populations in the Danelaw regions led to cultural exchanges that affected slavery practices on both sides, with intermarriage, trade relationships, and periodic political unification under Danish kings, creating conditions for the merger of different servile traditions. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age England includes artifacts associated with the slave trade, such as iron collars and shackles, similar to those found at Scandinavian trading centres like Hedeby, suggesting the material means through which human captives were restrained and controlled. The development of urban centres in Viking Age England, particularly the growth of York as a major commercial hub, created market infrastructure that facilitated the slave trade alongside commerce in other commodities. The excavations at Viking Age York have revealed extensive evidence of craft production, international trade, and the economic vitality that made the city one of Northern Europe's most important commercial centres during the 9th and 10th centuries. The slave markets that operated in York and other urban centres bought and sold captives, taken in raids, throughout the British Isles, with merchants transporting enslaved persons to Scandinavian markets or to the Islamic world via networks that extended through the Baltic Sea and down the river systems of Eastern Europe. The integration of England into these far-flung trading networks transformed slavery from a primarily domestic institution, serving local agricultural needs, into a commercial enterprise that generated profits through long-distance trade in human beings. The reconquest of the Danelaw by the kings of Wessex during the 10th century and the eventual unification of England under a single monarchy did not eliminate slavery, but instead created a unified kingdom where the institution continued to operate according to practices that combined Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian elements. The legal codes, issued by 10th century kings like Athelstan and Edgar, addressed slavery as an established part of the social order that required regulation to prevent abuse, while protecting the property rights of masters. The provisions in these laws that prohibited the export of slaves from England represented attempts to prevent the depopulation that could result from the commercial slave trade, reflecting royal concerns about maintaining adequate labour forces for agricultural production and military service. The penalties prescribed for slave dealers who violated export prohibitions were substantial, indicating that the trade was significant enough to warrant royal attention, and that enforcement was at least occasionally attempted. The economic importance of slavery in late Anglo-Saxon England can be assessed through various sources that provide evidence of slave ownership patterns, market values, and the distribution of unfree populations across different regions and social classes. The Domesday Book, the comprehensive survey of English landholdings, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, recorded substantial slave populations on estates throughout the country, though the numbers had declined significantly from earlier periods. The survey's documentation of servi, the Latin term used to designate slaves in the Domesday records, reveals that approximately 10% of the recorded population in 1086 was classified as enslaved, with regional variations that reflected different economic conditions and historical patterns of development. The regional distribution of slaves recorded in Domesday Book shows particularly high concentrations in the southwestern counties and along the Welsh borders, areas where slave raiding and warfare had provided continuing sources of captive labour. The correlation between frontier regions and high slave populations suggests the importance of military conflict as a mechanism for enslavement, while the relative scarcity of recorded slaves in eastern counties may reflect the influence of Scandinavian settlement patterns that relied more heavily on free peasant farmers than on slave labour. The manor-by-manor detail provided by the Domesday Survey allows for analysis of slave ownership across different landholding classes, revealing that both ecclesiastical institutions and lay aristocrats maintained enslaved workforces, with the proportions varying according to estate size and management practices. The larger estates, held by major landowners, typically employed more slaves than smaller holdings, though the relationship was not linear, and some substantial properties relied primarily on other forms of dependent labour. The tasks performed by slaves on late Anglo-Saxon estates continued to encompass the full range of agricultural and domestic work that had characterized earlier periods. But the 11th century saw increasing differentiation between slaves who performed general labor and those who possessed specialized skills. The slaves who worked as ploughmen, the aratores mentioned in various documents, occupied a particularly important role in estate agriculture, as the heavy ploughs that enabled cultivation of England's clay soils required teams of oxen and skilled operators who could manage the complex equipment. The investment required for plough teams and the specialized knowledge needed to use them effectively meant that ploughman slaves represented valuable assets whose training and maintenance required careful management. The domestic slaves who served in aristocratic households performed the cooking, cleaning, textile work, and other tasks necessary to maintain the elaborate establishments of wealthy landowners, with the size of slave staffs serving as visible markers of social status. The presence of substantial numbers of household slaves allowed aristocratic families to demonstrate their wealth through conspicuous consumption of labor, while the personal service provided by domestic slaves created relationships that were more intimate and potentially more complex than those between masters and agricultural workers. The legal status of slaves in late Anglo-Saxon England remained fundamentally unchanged from earlier periods, with enslaved persons lacking legal personality and existing as property, subject to the authority of masters, who could dispose of them according to their wishes. The laws that protected slaves from excessive cruelty or murder represented minimal constraints on masters' power, rather than recognition of slaves as persons with inherent rights. And enforcement of even these limited protections depended on legal procedures that were difficult for slaves to access. The testimony of slaves was generally inadmissible in legal proceedings, unless corroborated by free persons, creating barriers that prevented enslaved individuals from defending their interests through formal legal channels. The manumission procedures available in late Anglo-Saxon England followed patterns established in earlier centuries, with public ceremonies at churches or crossroads serving to create witnesses who could attest to the freed person's new status. The surviving manumission documents reveal the language used to effect legal freedom, with formal declarations that freed the slave as free as he was when born, or similar phrases that attempted to erase the legal disabilities of servile status. The conditions sometimes attached to manumissions required freed persons to provide continuing service to their former masters or to make payments that compensated for the economic loss of their labor, creating transitional statuses that fell between complete slavery and full freedom. The gradual decline in slavery that characterized the late Anglo-Saxon period and the century following the Norman conquest resulted from complex economic and social changes rather than from any principled opposition to the 1800s institution. The shift toward manorial agriculture that increasingly characterized 11th and 12th century England created different mechanisms for extracting labor from dependent populations, with villeinage and serfdom offering lords more flexible means of control than outright slavery. The development of these intermediate forms of unfreedom that bound peasants to the land and required them to provide labor services without reducing them to chattel property, reflected changing calculations about the most effective means of agricultural exploitation. The economic advantages of maintaining hereditary peasant populations tied to specific estates included the elimination of replacement costs associated with maintaining slave workforces through purchase, the reduction of supervision requirements when peasants worked their own holdings, in addition to providing services to lords, and the creation of stable communities that had stakes in maintaining productive capacity. The Norman conquest of 1066 introduced new ruling elites whose cultural backgrounds and legal traditions influenced the continuing evolution of English labor systems, though the immediate impact on slavery was less dramatic than might have been expected, given the scale of political transformation. The Norman and French aristocrats who replaced the Anglo-Saxon landholding class brought with them feudal principles of social organization that emphasized hierarchical bonds between lords and vassals. But these continental influences operated within an English context where slavery remained an established institution. The Domesday Survey, commissioned 20 years after the conquest, documented slavery as a continuing reality throughout the kingdom, suggesting that the Norman administrators who compiled the survey and the French-speaking lords who received English estates found slavery compatible with their economic interests and social assumptions. The gradual disappearance of slavery in England during the 12th and 13th centuries occurred through processes of manumission and the transformation of slave status into other forms of dependent labor, rather than through formal abolition or ideological rejection of human bondage. The factors that contributed to slavery's decline included economic calculations that made other labor arrangements more attractive, changing legal frameworks that redefined relationships between lords and peasants, ecclesiastical pressure that encouraged manumission without demanding abolition, and the development of market relationships that provided alternatives to direct coercion. The evolution of English common law during the 12th and 13th centuries established legal principles that gradually eroded the foundations of chattel slavery, while creating new forms of unfreedom that bound peasants to lords through legal obligations rather than property relationships. The legal doctrine that developed held that the air of England was too pure for slaves to breathe, a principle that would later be invoked to challenge slavery's legitimacy, though in its original medieval context, the maxim referred more narrowly to technical legal distinctions than to any broad commitment to human freedom. The villeins, who came to constitute the primary category of unfree labor in medieval England, occupied an ambiguous legal status that denied them full freedom, while according them certain protections unavailable to slaves. The villeins' bondage to the land and obligations to provide labor services to lords created restrictions on movement and economic autonomy, but villeinage operated through legal relationships that recognized peasants as persons rather than property. The inability of lords to sell villeins separately from the land they worked represented a crucial distinction from slavery, as did the gradual development of customary rights that limited lords' arbitrary authority and created expectations of reciprocal obligations. The manor courts that adjudicated disputes involving villeins established precedents that accumulated into bodies of customary law, providing peasants with bases for asserting claims against lords, even while affirming their unfree status. The agricultural economy of 13th century England that emerged during the period of population growth and economic expansion preceding the Black Death relied primarily on villein labor, supplemented by wage workers hired for seasonal tasks. The manorial system that organized agricultural production divided estate, lands between the domenzi, directly farmed for the lord's benefit, and the peasant holdings, whose occupants provided labor services on the domenzi in return for their tenure. The labor obligations that villeins owed varied according to local custom and individual agreements, with some peasants required to work several days per week on demesne lands, while others owed less frequent service, supplemented by payments in cash or kind. The complexity of these arrangements and the need to maintain detailed records of obligations and performance created administrative burdens that were managed through manorial bureaucracies, employing literate officials who kept rolls, documenting the customs and transactions that structured estate operations. The gradual commutation of labor services to money rents that accelerated during the 14th and 15th centuries, transformed the economic relationships between lords and peasants, while contributing to the erosion of unfree status. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death that killed perhaps half of England's population between 1348 and 1350 created labour shortages that fundamentally altered the bargaining power of peasants and wage workers. The massive mortality that devastated villages throughout England eliminated many workers, while leaving land and capital equipment relatively intact, creating conditions where surviving peasants and labourers could demand better terms for their work. The attempts by Parliament and royal authorities to maintain pre-plague wage levels and labour obligations through legislation like the Statute of Labourers of 1351 proved largely ineffective in preventing the pre-economic changes that labour scarcity produced. The enforcement mechanisms established to prevent wage increases and labour mobility faced resistance from both workers seeking better opportunities and employers willing to pay premium rates to secure adequate labour for their operations. The social tensions that resulted from attempts to maintain pre-plague conditions contributed to the upheaval of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which brought together various grievances about taxes, legal disabilities, and economic restrictions. The revolt's demands included the abolition of villenage and the establishment of uniform low rents for land, reflecting peasant aspirations for freedom from the legal restrictions that limited their economic opportunities and social mobility. The violent suppression of the revolt and the execution of its leaders did not reverse the economic forces that were gradually eroding villenage, as landlords found it increasingly difficult to enforce labour services and more profitable to convert obligations to money rents. The decline of villenage during the 15th century proceeded through individual manumissions, the abandonment of attempts to enforce labour services, and the growing acceptance of market relationships between landlords and tenants. The legal disabilities associated with unfree status gradually became less relevant to actual economic and social relationships, though the formal distinction between free and unfree tenure continued to exist in law. The villein families who achieved free status through manumission or through the lapsing of lords' attempts to enforce servile obligations became part of the growing class of independent peasant farmers who held land through copyhold, tenure that provided security against arbitrary eviction. The transformation from personal bondage to contractual relationships marked a fundamental shift in the organisation of agricultural labour that would characterise English rural society into the early modern period. The disappearance of indigenous slavery from England by the late medieval period meant that when English merchants and sailors began participating in the Atlantic slave trade during the 16th century, they were engaging with an institution that had no direct continuity with domestic English practices. The economic and legal foundations of Atlantic slavery developed in distinctive ways that reflected the particular conditions of New World colonization, though certain underlying assumptions about racial difference and the legitimacy of human bondage drew on longer traditions. The English involvement in Atlantic slavery began during the reign of Elizabeth I, when merchants sought to participate in the profitable trade that Portuguese and Spanish enterprises had pioneered in transporting enslaved Africans. American plantations. The first recorded English slave trading voyage occurred in 1562, when John Hawkins, a merchant from Plymouth, organized an expedition to West Africa, where he obtained approximately 300 enslaved persons through a combination of trade and violent capture. The subsequent transport of these captives across the Atlantic to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean represented England's entry into the transatlantic slave trade, though the venture's profitability attracted official disapproval from Queen Elizabeth, who initially expressed moral concerns about the enterprise. The Queen's objections centered on questions of consent and the legitimacy of enslaving persons who had not been taken in just wars or legally condemned to servitude, reflecting residual influence of medieval legal traditions about the proper sources of slavery. However, the substantial profits that Hawkins generated through his slaving voyages quickly overcame these scruples, and Elizabeth eventually became an investor in subsequent expeditions that transported thousands of enslaved Africans to American markets. The development of English colonial enterprises in the Caribbean and North America during the early 17th century created demand for labor that would drive the expansion of English participation in the slave trade. The establishment of colonies at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607 and on Barbados in 1627 initiated processes of settlement and economic development that would eventually rely heavily on enslaved African labor. Though the initial labor forces consisted primarily of English indentured servants and transported convicts, the tobacco cultivation that became Virginia's economic foundation required substantial labor inputs, but initially seemed compatible with temporary servitude arrangements that brought English workers to the colony for fixed terms of service. The sugar plantations that developed on Barbados during the 1630s and 1640s demanded even more intensive labor and created conditions where planters increasingly turned to enslaved Africans as their primary workforce. The transition from servant labor to slave labor in English colonies occurred gradually during the mid-17th century, as planters discovered that enslaved Africans offered economic advantages over indentured servants, despite the higher initial purchase costs. The permanent nature of slavery meant that planters did not face the recurring expense of replacing workers whose terms of service expired, while the hereditary transmission of slave status ensured that planters' investments in enslaved women would generate additional workers without further purchase costs. The legal framework that would define slavery in English colonies developed through the accumulation of statutes and court decisions that addressed specific questions about slave status, the treatment of offspring from mixed relationships, and the property rights of slaveholders. The absence of slavery within England itself meant that colonial legislatures operated without the constraint of domestic precedents and could design legal regimes specifically suited to plantation conditions. The Virginia Assembly began passing laws regulating slavery during the 1660s, with a 1662 statute establishing that children born in the colony would follow the condition of their mothers, reversing the English common law principle that legitimate children followed their father's status. This legal innovation served planters' interests by ensuring that children of enslaved women would be slaves, regardless of their father's condition, permitting sexual exploitation of enslaved women while preserving the slavery of the resulting children. The codification of race-based slavery in English colonial law occurred through a series of statutes passed during the late 17th century that explicitly tied enslaved status to African ancestry and created legal disabilities that applied specifically to persons of African descent. The racial ideology that undergirded these legal developments represented a significant departure from earlier forms of slavery that had not necessarily linked bondage to inherent racial characteristics, though earlier practices had certainly involved prejudices based on cultural and ethnic differences. The elaboration of scientific racism during the 18th century would provide pseudo-biological justifications for the association between African ancestry and enslaved status, with writers producing extensive literature arguing that racial differences reflected divine design or natural hierarchies that made slavery appropriate for Africans. The entrenchment of slavery in English Caribbean colonies during the late 17th and 18th centuries created societies where enslaved Africans formed substantial majorities of the population and where every aspect of economic, social, and political life revolved around the maintenance of slavery. The sugar plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands produced enormous wealth for their owners, while subjecting enslaved workers to some of the harshest conditions in the history of human bondage. The mortality rates on Caribbean sugar estates were extraordinarily high due to the combination of brutal working conditions, inadequate nutrition, tropical diseases, and the physical punishment that planters and overseers inflicted to maintain discipline and maximize production. The labor demands of sugar cultivation and processing required enslaved workers to perform exhausting physical work during harvest season that could extend for 20 hours per day over periods of several months, with field workers cutting cane and hauling it to mills where other enslaved persons fed it into crushing equipment that extracted the juice for processing into sugar and molasses. The integration of slavery into English national economy occurred through the development of extensive commercial networks that connected plantation production in the Americas with manufacturing centers in England and markets throughout Europe and beyond. The triangular trade that characterized much Atlantic commerce during the 18th century involved the transport of manufactured goods from England to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved persons. The Middle Passage voyage that carried captive Africans across the Atlantic to American markets, and the return shipment of colonial products to England, where they supplied raw materials for industry and commodities for domestic consumption and re-export. The ports of Bristol, Liverpool, and London became major centers of the slave trade during the 18th century, with each city developing specialized merchant communities whose operations focused on organizing and financing slaving voyages. The Bristol merchants who dominated the slave trade during the early 18th century accumulated fortunes through their investments in slaving ventures that transported tens of thousands of enslaved Africans to American plantations. The physical infrastructure that developed in these ports to support the slave trade included warehouses for storing trade goods destined for African markets, facilities for outfitting ships with the specialized equipment needed for transporting human cargoes, and financial institutions that provided credit for the expensive operations required to purchase slaves in Africa and transport them across the Atlantic. The insurance companies that emerged to underwrite the risks of slave trading developed actuarial practices that calculated expected mortality rates during the Middle Passage and established policies covering losses from slave, rebellion, shipwreck, and other hazards specific to the human cargo trade. The Liverpool merchants who came to dominate the English slave trade during the later 18th century refined the commercial practices and developed the ship designs that would make their port the leading slave trading center in Down Centre, the Atlantic world. The specialized slave ships that Liverpool yards constructed featured configurations designed to maximize the number of captives that could be transported while maintaining sufficient survival rates to ensure profitable voyages. The infamous tight packing that characterized many slave ships involved chaining enslaved persons in spaces so confined that they could not sit upright or turn over, with men, women, and children arranged in rows separated by minimal spacing that created conditions promoting disease transmission and psychological trauma. The mortality rates during the Middle Passage varied considerably according to voyage length, disease outbreaks, and the degree of overcrowding that captains permitted, with overall death rates during the 18th century averaging perhaps 15%, though some voyages experienced losses exceeding 50% of their human cargoes. The maritime labor that operated slave ships consisted of sailors whose working conditions were often harsh and whose treatment by captains could approach the brutality visited upon enslaved cargoes. Though the legal status and ultimate fate of crew members differed fundamentally from that of captive Africans, the sailors who signed on to slave ships frequently did so out of economic necessity or because deception by recruiters had misrepresented the nature of the voyages, with many crew members discovering only after departure that they had joined slaving expeditions. The discipline that captains maintained aboard slave ships was notoriously severe, with flogging and other physical punishments routinely inflicted on sailors who failed to perform their duties or who challenged officers' authority. The mortality rates among crew members on slave ships exceeded those on other types of merchant vessels due to exposure to African diseases during the extended periods required to purchase slave cargoes and to the violence that sometimes erupted during slave rebellions or in conflicts with African coastal populations. The insurance records and ship's logs that documented slaving voyages provide detailed evidence of the commercial calculations and operational practices that structured the trade in human beings, with captains maintaining careful accounts of their expenses, the prices paid for enslaved persons in Africa, the provisions consumed during the Atlantic crossing, and the final sale prices achieved in American markets. The Middle Passage experiences of enslaved Africans transported aboard English ships involved horrors that stretched the limits of human endurance and that produced psychological trauma extending far beyond the physical sufferings of the voyage itself. The capture in Africa and the forced march to coastal barracoons, where slavers assembled their human cargoes, began processes of dehumanization that intensified during the oceanic crossing. The branding of enslaved persons with marks indicating their purchasers, the removal of clothing, and the replacement of names with numbers, and the systematic use of violence to suppress resistance, all serve to transform persons with individual identities and cultural backgrounds into commodities measured by their market value. The Middle Passage journeys, that typically lasted between 6 and 8 weeks, subjected enslaved Africans to conditions designed to minimize costs rather than to preserve human welfare, with provisions calculated to prevent starvation while providing minimal nutrition and with sanitation arrangements that created environments of indescribable filth. The psychological impact of the Middle Passage included the terror of captivity by alien peoples, whose languages could not be understood, the grief of separation from families and communities that would never be seen again, and the anticipation of unknown fates in lands beyond imagining. The resistance that enslaved Africans mounted against their captors took various forms, ranging from individual refusal to eat to coordinated revolts that occasionally succeeded in taking control of vessels. The suicide attempts by enslaved persons who threw themselves overboard or who starved themselves to death represented desperate assertions of agency in situations where death might seem preferable to the anticipated horrors of enslavement. The revolts that erupted aboard slave ships occurred with sufficient frequency that captains developed elaborate security procedures, including the maintenance of weapons, caches, the installation of nets along ships' sides to prevent captives from jumping overboard, and the practice of keeping male captives shackled throughout the voyage, while sometimes allowing women and children greater freedom of movement. The suppression of slave revolts involved extreme violence that served both to regain control of vessels and to terrorize survivors into submission, with captains ordering the execution of rebellion leaders through methods designed to inflict maximum suffering while creating examples that would deter future resistance. The arrival of slave ships at American ports initiated sale procedures that once again treated enslaved Africans as commodities to be inspected, evaluated, and purchased according to market conditions and buyers' assessment of individuals' potential labor value. The auction procedures varied between different colonial markets, with some ports conducting shipboard sales that allowed planters to inspect captives aboard vessels, while others used public auction houses where enslaved persons were displayed for examination by potential buyers. The physical inspections that preceded purchases involved degrading examinations of bodies to assess health, strength, and reproductive capacity, with buyers examining teeth, muscles, and genitals, while questioning captives about their ages, skills, and origins. The prices that enslaved persons commanded reflected market conditions, including local demand for labor, the perceived characteristics of different African ethnic groups, and individual attributes like age, sex, physical condition, and evidence of prior training. The separation of families during sale procedures inflicted additional trauma on persons already devastated by their experiences of capture and transportation, as mothers were torn from children, husbands from wives, and siblings from each other without regard for the emotional bonds that connected them. The first generation of enslaved Africans who arrived in English colonies faced not only the hardships of forced labor, but also the challenges of adapting to radically unfamiliar environments, learning new languages, and creating communities among persons who came from diverse African societies with different cultural traditions. The development of African American cultures in English colonies involved complex processes of cultural retention, innovation, and adaptation as enslaved persons drew on their varied African backgrounds while responding to the specific conditions of plantation life and the need to communicate across linguistic and ethnic boundaries. The creolization processes that shaped these emerging cultures included the development of new languages like Gullah in the South Carolina Low Country that combined elements of English with African grammatical structures, vocabulary, the creation of syncretic religious practices that blended African spiritual traditions with Christianity, and the elaboration of musical forms that would profoundly influence American cultural development. The material conditions of slavery in English colonies varied according to the crops cultivated, regional climate and geography, and the specific practices of individual planters, but certain commonalities characterized the institution across different settings. The housing provided to enslaved persons typically consisted of crude cabins that offered minimal shelter and little privacy, with multiple families sometimes crowded into single-room structures that lacked adequate protection from weather extremes. The clothing distributed to enslaved workers was produced from cheap cloth that provided basic covering while marking slave status through its inferior quality and limited quantity. The food rations that planters provided were calculated to maintain work capacity rather than to satisfy hunger or provide balanced nutrition, with corn and salt pork forming the dietary staples, supplemented by vegetables that enslaved persons grew in small garden plots when time and circumstances permitted. The working conditions that enslaved persons endured involved physical labor of an intensity and duration that broke down bodies and shortened lifespans, with field workers performing repetitive tasks that led to chronic injuries and disabilities. The use of violence to maintain discipline and maximize production remained central to slavery's operation throughout its existence in English colonies, with whipping serving as the standard punishment for perceived infractions. The whips used on enslaved persons were designed to inflict maximum pain while creating lasting marks that served as visible warnings to others, with some particularly cruel overseers and masters competing to devise new refinements of torment. The sexual violence that accompanied slavery represented another dimension of the institution's brutality, with enslaved women subject to rape by masters, overseers, and other white men who faced no legal consequences for assaults that would have been crimes if committed against free white women. The children born from these rapes were slaves who might be sold away from their mothers, sometimes by their own fathers, in transactions that demonstrated slavery's capacity to utterly corrupt family relationships and moral sensibilities. The slave codes enacted by colonial legislatures created comprehensive legal frameworks that defined enslaved status, regulated the treatment of enslaved persons, and established the mechanisms through which slavery would be enforced. The Virginia Slave Code of 1705 consolidated earlier legislation into a systematic legal regime that would serve as a model for other colonies, establishing racial slavery as a hereditary condition transmitted through the maternal line, and creating specific disabilities that applied to all persons of African descent, whether enslaved or free. The restrictions on enslaved persons' movement required written passes for any travel beyond their home plantations, with slave patrols organized to intercept and question persons of color found away from their assigned locations. The prohibition on enslaved persons learning to read and write reflected planters' fears that literacy would enable slave resistance through the circulation of subversive ideas and the forging of travel documents. The legal barriers to manumission that many colonies erected during the 18th century revealed slaveholders' concerns about the growth of free black populations that might provide aid to enslaved persons or serve as examples, undermining slavery's ideological foundations. The religious instruction of enslaved persons became a contested issue that divided slaveholders between those who believed that Christianity would promote docility and acceptance of earthly bondage, and those who feared that religious teachings about spiritual equality would encourage resistance. The missionaries and ministers who catechized enslaved persons emphasized biblical passages that commanded servants to obey their masters and that portrayed earthly suffering as a pathway to heavenly reward, while carefully avoiding texts that spoke of liberation or that challenged unjust authority. The religious communities that enslaved persons created often incorporated elements that masters had not intended, with services that allowed emotional expression and that created spaces where enslaved persons could gather beyond direct white supervision. The spirituals that developed in these religious contexts combined Christian themes with African musical traditions and sometimes contained coded messages about resistance and escape that were intelligible to enslaved participants while remaining obscure to white observers. The resistance that enslaved persons mounted against their bondage took forms ranging from everyday acts of non-cooperation to organized rebellions that sought to overthrow slavery through armed struggle. The subtle forms of resistance that characterized daily life on plantations included work slowdowns, feigned illness, tool breaking, and other tactics that reduced the profitability of slavery, while remaining difficult for masters to definitively identify and punish. The theft of food and other goods represented both resistance against exploitation and necessary survival strategies for persons whose masters provided inadequate provisions, with enslaved persons developing moral frameworks that distinguish between stealing from each other, which was wrong, and taking from masters, which was reappropriation of the products of their own labor. The escape attempts that individual enslaved persons made represented more direct challenges to slavery, with some runaways seeking temporary refuge to avoid punishment or to visit family members on nearby plantations, while others attempted to reach free territories or to disappear into communities of fugitives who maintained autonomous existence in marginal regions. The maroon communities that formed in swamps, mountains, and frontier areas provided refuges for escaped slaves and bases for raids against plantations, though the difficulty of maintaining secure settlements in proximity to slave societies, determined to suppress them, meant that most maroon communities remained small and vulnerable. The organized rebellions that erupted periodically in English slave societies represented the ultimate form of resistance and provoked extreme violent responses designed to terrorize enslaved populations into submission. The Stono Rebellion that exploded in South Carolina in 1739 involved approximately 100 enslaved persons who seized weapons and marched towards Spanish Florida, where they hoped to find freedom, killing more than 20 white persons before militia forces suppressed the uprising and executed its participants. The extensive reprisals that followed the rebellion included torture and execution of suspected conspirators, and the imposition of even harsher restrictions on enslaved persons' movements and gatherings. The conspiracy that Denmark Vesey organized in Charleston in 1822 planned a massive uprising that would have involved thousands of enslaved persons in a coordinated attack on the city, but betrayal led to the plot's discovery before it could be executed and resulted in the execution of Vesey and 34 alleged co-conspirators. The Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia in 1831 represented the most extensive slave revolt in the United States, with Turner and his followers killing approximately 60 white persons before militia and federal troops suppressed the uprising. The wave of violence that whites inflicted on black communities following Turner's rebellion included the murder of hundreds of enslaved and free black persons who had no connection to the revolt, demonstrating the terror that slave rebellions inspired among white populations and the brutal methods they employed to maintain control. The impact of the American Revolution on slavery in England and its colonies proved complex and contradictory, as revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and natural rights created ideological challenges to slavery, while the practical politics of maintaining colonial unity limited the extent to which revolutionary principles would be applied to enslaved populations. The presence of slavery in all 13 colonies that rebelled against British authority meant that revolutionary leaders who denounced British tyranny often themselves held enslaved persons and benefited economically from slavery. The contradiction between revolutionary ideals and slavery's reality troubled some revolutionary leaders and provided openings for enslaved persons and their allies to challenge the institution's legitimacy. The Somerset case, decided by English courts in 1772, shortly before the American Revolution began, established the principle that slavery was not supported by common law in England, and that enslaved persons brought to England could not be forcibly returned to slavery in the colonies. The case involved James Somerset, an enslaved man brought from Virginia to London by his master Charles Stewart, who escaped but was recaptured and placed aboard a ship bound for Jamaica, where he was to be sold. The habeas corpus petition filed on Somerset's behalf by abolitionists led to Lord Chief Justice Mansfield's ruling that masters could not remove enslaved persons from England against their will because slavery was so odious that it could only exist where supported by positive law. The ruling's practical impact was limited, as it did not abolish slavery in British colonies and applied only to enslaved persons physically present in England, but it provided important precedent for later anti-slavery legal arguments and encouraged the development of organized abolitionist movements. The formation of anti-slavery societies in Britain during the late 18th century brought together religious activists, particularly Quakers, who had concluded that slavery was incompatible with Christian principles, with political reformers who saw slavery as an affront to Enlightenment ideals about human rights and moral progress. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, founded in 1787, organized the first sustained political campaign against slavery in British history, employing publicity techniques that included the wide distribution of pamphlets and images depicting slavery's cruelties. The famous diagram of the slave ship Brooks showing the tight packing of enslaved persons in the vessel's hold, became one of the most effective pieces of anti-slavery propaganda, making visible the horrors of the Middle Passage in ways that challenged slavery's supporters to defend the indefensible. The testimony of former enslaved persons like Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography published in 1789 provided detailed first-hand accounts of slavery's brutalities, gave anti-slavery campaigns powerful moral authority and undermined pro-slavery arguments that claimed enslaved Africans were contented with their condition. The political campaign that culminated in Parliament's abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 represented a remarkable achievement of organized moral activism that overcame powerful economic interests and entrenched political opposition. The abolitionist movement that brought about the slave trade's end drew support from diverse constituencies, including religious dissenters, motivated by moral conviction, manufacturing interests seeking to undermine Caribbean planters' political influence, and workers who connected slavery's abolition to broader struggles for political reform and economic justice. The parliamentary leadership of William Wilberforce, who devoted decades to anti-slavery advocacy, provided the movement with an articulate spokesman whose social connections and political skills enabled him to build coalitions that eventually commanded legislative majorities. The gradual accumulation of support for abolition reflected changing intellectual climates that made slavery increasingly difficult to defend in terms compatible with emerging liberal political philosophies and Enlightenment assumptions about human progress. The economic calculations that influenced debates about abolition included arguments that slave labor was less efficient than free labor, and that the prohibition of the slave trade would benefit British economic interests by forcing competitors to pay higher prices for labor while encouraging more capital-intensive production methods that favored British manufacturing. The passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807 prohibited British subjects from participating in the transportation of enslaved persons and authorized the Royal Navy to intercept slave ships and free their human cargoes. Though the legislation did not address the continued existence of slavery in British colonies, where millions of persons remained in bondage, the enforcement of the slave trade prohibition involved diplomatic negotiations with other nations to secure international cooperation. The establishment of naval patrols along the African coast to intercept slave ships, and the creation of courts in Sierra Leone and other locations to adjudicate cases involving captured vessels. The anti-slavery squadron that the Royal Navy maintained off West Africa from 1808 until the 1860s intercepted hundreds of slave ships and liberated more than 100,000 enslaved persons who were then settled in Sierra Leone or other British territories. The continuation of slavery in British colonies for more than a quarter century after the abolition of the slave trade reflected the political power of West Indian planters who argued that immediate emancipation would destroy colonial economies and that slavery could be reformed through amelioration measures that would improve enslaved persons' conditions without eliminating the institution. The amelioration policies that colonial authorities attempted to implement during the 1820s proved largely ineffectual due to planters' resistance and the lack of effective enforcement mechanisms, leading abolitionists to conclude that slavery itself had to be abolished rather than merely reformed. The slave rebellion that erupted in Jamaica in 1831 and that came to be known as the Baptist War or Christmas Rebellion involved tens of thousands of enslaved persons who sought freedom through armed resistance after Founder Vida, concluding that amelioration promises would never be fulfilled. The massive scale of the uprising and the brutal reprisals that followed convinced many in Britain that slavery could not be maintained without constant violence, and that emancipation was both morally necessary and practically inevitable. The Slavery Abolition Act passed by Parliament in 1833 mandated the gradual elimination of slavery throughout British colonies through a system of apprenticeship that would transition enslaved persons to freedom over a period of years. The legislation provided compensation totaling £20 million to slaveholders for the loss of their human property, an enormous sum representing approximately 40% of the British government's annual expenditure, while providing nothing to the formerly enslaved persons whose labour had been stolen and whose bodies had been brutalised. The apprenticeship system established by the Abolition Act required former slaves to continue working for their previous masters for fixed periods that varied according to their previous occupations, with field workers obligated to serve 6 years and skilled workers and domestic servants 4 years. The continuation of coerced labor under apprenticeship reflected the desire to placate planters while maintaining plantation production during a transition period that was supposed to prepare both former slaves and colonial economies for, to pounce it, fully free labor relations. The abuses that characterized apprenticeship, including continued use of physical punishment and the manipulation of regulations to extend periods of service, led to growing pressure for immediate full emancipation. The termination of apprenticeship in 1838, 2 years earlier than originally planned, finally brought legal slavery in British colonies to a complete end and freed approximately 700,000 persons who had endured bondage. The transition from slavery to freedom in British Caribbean colonies occurred amid economic disruption, as former slaves sought to establish independent lives, while planters struggled to maintain plantation production without the coercive mechanisms that had previously ensured labor availability. The freed persons who sought to escape plantation labor entirely faced obstacles, including planters' control of land and colonial authorities' efforts to create legal frameworks that would maintain labor discipline through vagrancy laws and other measures designed to force former slaves into wage work on terms favorable to employers. The establishment of free villages, where former slaves could purchase small plots of land and create independent communities, represented important steps toward genuine freedom, though the limited availability of land and the economic pressures created by colonial economic structures constrained the possibilities for autonomous development. The immigration of indentured laborers from India and China to Caribbean colonies during the mid-19th century reflected planters' desires to maintain cheap labor supplies and to avoid the need to pay wages sufficient to attract free workers, creating new systems of exploitation that shared troubling similarities with the slavery that had recently been abolished. The impact of slavery's abolition on Britain itself extended beyond the immediate effects of ending colonial bondage to include the development of anti-slavery movements' organizational techniques and rhetorical strategies that would influence subsequent reform campaigns. The mass petition drives that abolitionists organized demonstrated the potential of coordinated political activism to shape policy on moral issues, despite opposition from entrenched interests, with hundreds of thousands of signatures gathered on petitions demanding emancipation. The participation of women in anti-slavery campaigns provided experience in political organizing and public advocacy that contributed to the emergence of women's rights movements, as female activists who had mobilized around slavery's abolition applied similar methods to challenging women's legal and political disabilities. The economic consequences of slavery's abolition for British industries that had depended on slave-produced commodities required adjustments that generally proved less disruptive than slavery's defenders had predicted, with markets adapting to changed labor conditions, and with British manufacturing continuing to grow despite the ending of colonial slavery. The moral legacy of slavery's abolition established principles about human rights and the illegitimacy of chattel slavery that would inform subsequent international efforts to combat slavery and forced labor, though the persistence of various forms of exploitation demonstrated the gap between formal legal prohibitions and the achievement of genuine freedom and economic justice. The historiography of slavery in England has evolved significantly across successive generations of scholarship, with different periods emphasizing various aspects of the institution and reaching varying conclusions about its significance for English history. The 19th century historical writing that addressed slavery often approached it as an unfortunate episode that had been overcome through moral progress, with abolitionism portrayed as evidence of British civilization's superiority and humanitarian character. The tendency of Victorian historians to celebrate abolition while minimizing slavery's extent and importance in English history reflected broader nationalist narratives that emphasized moral advancement while obscuring the economic benefits that slavery had generated for British development. The early 20th century scholarship that examined slavery's role in economic history, particularly the work of Eric Williams in Capitalism and Slavery, published in 1944, fundamentally challenged earlier interpretations by arguing that slavery had been central to British capital accumulation and industrial development. Williams contended that the profits generated by slave trading and plantation agriculture had provided crucial investment capital for industrialization, that the markets created by slavery and the slave trade had stimulated manufacturing growth, and that slavery's abolition had resulted more from changing economic interests than from humanitarian motives. The provocative thesis that Williams advanced sparked extensive scholarly debate that continues to shape discussions about the relationships between slavery, capitalism, and British economic development. The scholarship of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has employed sophisticated quantitative methods and expanded archival research to assess slavery's economic impact more precisely, while also examining slavery's social and cultural dimensions with greater attention to the experiences of enslaved persons themselves. The demographic studies that have analyzed the slave trade's scale and mortality rates provide detailed evidence of the human costs that the trade inflicted, with estimates suggesting that British ships transported approximately 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1660 and 1807, and that millions more died in Africa during capture and transport to the coast. The economic historians who have evaluated slavery's contribution to British industrialization have reached varied conclusions about the extent to which slave-generated profits funded industrial investment, with some scholars emphasizing the importance of slave trade wealth, while others argue that domestic sources of capital were more significant. The cultural historians who have examined how slavery shaped British identity, literature, and popular culture have revealed the extent to which the institution pervaded British life, even as it remained physically distant from the British Isles themselves. The lasting impact of slavery on England extended beyond the immediate economic benefits and the moral stain of participation in human bondage, to include the development of racial ideologies that would shape British imperialism, domestic race relations for centuries after slavery's abolition. The racial hierarchies that slavery both reflected and reinforced became embedded in British culture through literature, science, and popular discourse that portrayed persons of African descent as inferior and that rationalized exploitation through claims about biological difference and cultural inadequacy. The pseudoscientific racism that flourished during the 19th century drew on earlier pro-slavery arguments while elaborating new theories about racial difference that purported to demonstrate African inferiority through cranial measurements, evolutionary speculation, and selective cultural comparisons. The persistence of racist attitudes long after slavery's abolition demonstrates how deeply the institution had shaped British consciousness, and how difficult it would prove to eliminate the prejudices that slavery had both required and cultivated. The memory of slavery in British culture has been contested terrain, where competing narratives have struggled over how the institution should be understood and what lessons should be drawn from its history. The commemoration of abolition has sometimes overshadowed attention to the centuries during which British merchants, investors, and colonists profited from slavery, creating a public memory that celebrates Britain's role in ending the slave trade while minimizing acknowledgement of its role in creating and sustaining the Atlantic slave system. The monuments to slave traders and plantation owners that remain prominent features of British cities, and the country houses built with slavery-derived wealth that are now tourist attractions, represent physical traces of slavery's integration into British society that complicate efforts to consign the institution to a safely distant past. The campaigns for reparations that have sought compensation for slavery's historic injustices have argued that the wealth extracted through slave labor and the ongoing effects of slavery-generated racial inequality create moral and practical claims for redress that cannot be satisfied through acknowledgement alone. The opponents of reparations have contended that the temporal distance from slavery makes it impossible to identify beneficiaries and responsible parties with sufficient precision to implement just compensation schemes, and that the abolition of slavery itself constituted adequate reparation for historic wrongs. The scholarly work that has documented slavery's centrality to British economic development, and that has traced the intergenerational transmission of wealth derived from slavery, provides evidence supporting reparations arguments, while also complicating simple narratives about historic responsibility and contemporary obligation. The process of confronting slavery's legacy in England has involved growing recognition of the need to incorporate this history into national narratives that have often preferred to emphasize Britain's role in abolition, while minimizing acknowledgement of its prior role in slavery's expansion. The educational curricula that determine how slavery is taught in British schools have been subjects of political controversy, with debates about whether the focus should be on Britain's participation in slavery or on its leadership in abolition, and about how to present the history in ways that acknowledge injustice while avoiding the promotion of either racial guilt or resentment. The public history projects that have sought to make slavery's history visible in the physical landscape include the installation of plaques acknowledging slavery connections at historic sites, the renaming of streets and buildings that honored slave traders, and the creation of museums and memorials that center the experiences of enslaved persons rather than celebrating abolitionists. The resistance to some of these commemorative efforts has revealed the ongoing sensitivity of slavery's history and the ways that acknowledgement of historic injustice can be perceived as threatening to established narratives of national achievement and moral superiority. The connection between England's history of slavery and contemporary racial inequality in Britain has become an increasingly central focus of activism and scholarship that seeks to demonstrate how the past continues to shape present conditions. The disproportionate poverty, unemployment, and educational disadvantage that characterize many communities of African and Caribbean descent in Britain can be traced to policies and practices that have their roots in slavery-era racial ideologies and that have been perpetuated through successive forms of discrimination. The immigration policies that governed the arrival of Caribbean migrants to Britain during the mid-20th century and the treatment that these populations received revealed the persistence of racial hierarchies that slavery had established, with persons whose ancestors had been enslaved by British subjects finding themselves treated as unwelcome foreigners when they sought to settle in Britain. The Windrush scandal that erupted in 2018, when it was revealed that British authorities had wrongly detained and deported Caribbean-born residents who had lived in Britain for decades, demonstrated the ongoing vulnerability of communities whose connection to Britain had been forged through slavery and colonialism. The cultural legacy of slavery in England includes the literature, music, and artistic traditions that enslaved persons and their descendants created and that have enriched British and world culture, while also bearing witness to suffering and resistance. The slave narratives published by formerly enslaved persons like Olaudah Equiano and Mary Prince in the late 18th and early 19th centuries represent not only important historical sources, but also literary achievements that helped establish the tradition of African diasporic writing in English. The influence of African-descended populations on British musical development, particularly in the Caribbean-influenced genres that have shaped British popular music since the mid-20th century, demonstrates the creative vitality of communities whose ancestors endured slavery's dehumanization. The contemporary British writers of African and Caribbean descent, whose work engages with slavery's legacy, including authors like Carol Phillips, Andrea Levy, and Bernardine Evaristo, have produced powerful explorations of how historic trauma and displacement continue to shape identity and experience across generations. The international dimensions of slavery's history include Britain's role in pressuring other nations to abolish slavery after terminating its own involvement in the institution, with British diplomatic and military power employed to spread abolition during the 19th century. The treaties that Britain negotiated with other European powers and with African states sought to prohibit the slave trade and to establish enforcement mechanisms, including the right of search that would allow British naval vessels to inspect suspected slave ships. The Royal Navy's anti-slavery patrols off the African coast intercepted slave ships from various nations and freed tens of thousands of enslaved persons, though the effectiveness of these efforts was limited by the vastness of the areas that needed to be patrolled and by the resistance of other nations to British interference with their commercial activities. The moral authority that Britain claimed through its anti-slavery advocacy existed in tension with its continued involvement in other forms of imperial exploitation and with the creation of new coercive labor systems that replaced slavery. In some colonial contexts, the indentured labor systems that brought workers from India and China to former slave colonies and to other British imperial possessions, operated through legal contracts that theoretically distinguished them from slavery, but that practice often involved coercion, debt bondage, and working conditions that differed little from outright slavery. The historical assessment of slavery's place in English history requires grappling with the uncomfortable reality that an institution fundamentally at odds with proclaimed British values of liberty and justice was central to British economic development and remained legally sanctioned in British territories until the mid-19th century. The complexity of slavery's history resists simple moral narratives that would either entirely condemn earlier generations or excuse their participation in an institution that they should have recognized as evil. The existence of anti-slavery sentiment in England from the early modern period demonstrates that moral criticism of slavery was available to contemporaries, and that the institution's continuation resulted from willing participation by those who benefited from it, rather than from innocent ignorance of its injustice. The gradual process through which slavery became unacceptable to British public opinion during the late 18th and early 19th centuries reflected changing economic conditions, evolving political philosophies, and the effective activism of abolitionist movements, but it also revealed the depth of commitment to slavery among those whose interests it served, and the extent of resistance that had to be overcome before abolition could be achieved. The historiographical debates about slavery's significance for British development have evolved from arguments about economic causation to more nuanced discussions that recognize multiple forms of influence, including cultural, political, and ideological effects, alongside economic impacts. The recognition that slavery shaped British institutions, identities, and global position in ways that cannot be reduced to simple calculations of profit and investment has led to more sophisticated analyses of how the institution functioned as part of larger systems of power and exploitation. The connections between slavery and the development of modern capitalism have been central to recent scholarship that has examined how slavery contributed to the creation of financial instruments, commercial practices, and labor control mechanisms that would characterize industrial capitalism. The use of slaves as collateral for loans, the development of sophisticated insurance mechanisms for slave traders and owners, and the creation of complex commercial networks linking production, transport, and marketing all represented innovations that slavery stimulated and that would prove transferable to other economic contexts. The forced migration of millions of Africans across the Atlantic represented one of the largest movements of people in world history and had demographic, cultural, and economic consequences that shaped the development of the Americas, Africa, and Europe. The extraction of labor and resources from enslaved populations in American colonies generated wealth that flowed to Europe and that funded economic development, military expansion, and cultural production that established European global dominance. The racist ideologies that justified slavery became embedded in Western culture and continued to shape racial attitudes and policies long after slavery's abolition, creating legacies of discrimination and inequality that persist in various forms. The moral reckoning that slavery's history demands involves acknowledgement of the injustices that were committed, recognition of how those historic wrongs continue to affect present conditions, and consideration of what obligations that history creates for contemporary societies. The debates about how to address slavery's legacy reflect broader disagreements about historic responsibility, the nature of justice, and the possibilities for meaningful redress of past wrongs. The challenge of confronting slavery's history honestly while avoiding either defensive minimization or paralyzing guilt requires nuanced engagement with the complex realities of how ordinary people participated in extraordinary evil and how systems of exploitation become normalized within societies that may otherwise celebrate justice and human dignity. The educational imperative of teaching slavery's history accurately and comprehensively faces obstacles, including political resistance from those who prefer celebratory national narratives, pedagogical challenges in presenting disturbing material to young students, and the difficulty of conveying the scale of suffering that slavery involved while maintaining historical perspective and analytical rigor. The ongoing production of scholarship about slavery's history continually revises and deepens understanding of the institution, its operations, its impacts, and its meanings, with archival discoveries and new methodological approaches, generating fresh insights that complicate and enrich historical knowledge. The digital humanities projects that have made slavery-related sources more accessible through online databases and that have employed computational methods to analyze patterns in slave trading, plantation records, and other documentary evidence have opened new possibilities for research, while also making primary sources available to broader audiences. The public engagement with slavery's history through museums, commemorative sites, and popular media has increased awareness of the institution's significance, while also sometimes producing oversimplified or sensationalized treatments that sacrifice historical complexity for emotional impact. The challenge of public history is to make slavery's history accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences, while maintaining scholarly standards and resisting the tendency to present the past primarily as a source of moral lessons for the present. The literature on slavery in England encompasses not only historical scholarship, but also philosophical and ethical analyses that examine the moral dimensions of slavery and the arguments that were made for and against it. The Enlightenment-era debates about natural rights and human equality provided conceptual resources for anti-slavery arguments, but also generated counterclaims that enslaved persons lacked the rational capacities that would entitle them to full moral status. The religious arguments about slavery drew on biblical texts that could be interpreted to either support or condemn the institution, with both sides claiming scriptural authority for their positions. The economic arguments about slavery's efficiency and its effects on economic development have been central to both contemporary debates and subsequent historical analysis, with different assumptions about market efficiency, labor motivation, and development dynamics, producing divergent conclusions. The legal debates about slavery's status in English common law and about the proper relationship between colonial law and metropolitan legal principles raised fundamental questions about sovereignty, property rights, and the sources of legitimate authority. The comparison of slavery in England with slavery in other contexts reveals both commonalities and distinctions that illuminate the institution's core features and its variable manifestations across different societies. The Roman slavery that had operated in England during the early centuries of the Common Era differed from later forms in its basis in conquest and legal tradition, rather than in racial ideology, and in the pathways to freedom that manumission practices provided. The medieval English slavery that emerged after the Roman withdrawal shared features with other European servile institutions, while also possessing distinctive characteristics shaped by Anglo-Saxon legal traditions and social structures. The Atlantic slavery that English merchants and colonists developed from the 16th century onward represented a form of bondage more brutal and more thoroughly racialized than most earlier systems, with its basis in commercial agriculture for distant markets, creating incentives for extreme exploitation. The comparison between slavery and other forms of coerced labor, including serfdom, debt bondage, and indentured servitude, reveals that the distinction between enslaved and free status was not always as clear as modern sensibilities might expect, with various intermediate statuses creating complex hierarchies of freedom and bondage. The legal definitions that distinguish slavery from other forms of unfreedom typically emphasize the slave's status as property subject to sale, the hereditary transmission of enslaved status, and the master's extensive authority over the slave's person, though the actual conditions of life for slaves and for other categories of coerced laborers could be similar. The economic logic of slavery rested on the ability of masters to extract labor from enslaved persons without providing compensation beyond minimal subsistence and without facing competitive pressure to improve conditions or increase rewards. The profitability of slavery depended on keeping costs low through the use of violence rather than incentives, through the minimization of material provisions, and through the exploitation of slaves' reproductive capacity to generate additional workers without purchase costs. The calculations that slaveholders made about the relative merits of preserving slaves' health and longevity versus working them to death and replacing them through purchase varied according to the cost of new slaves and the nature of the work being performed, with Caribbean sugar plantations notoriously treating slaves as disposable labor to be used up and replaced rather than as long-term investments to be maintained. The gendered dimensions of slavery included the sexual exploitation of enslaved women and the ways that gender affected both the treatment of enslaved persons and their strategies of resistance. The rape of enslaved women by masters and overseers represented both a mechanism of terror and control and a means by which masters could increase their slave holdings through the children born from these assaults. The separation of enslaved mothers from their children through sale represented one of slavery's most traumatic features and a form of violence that particularly affected women who had to endure the loss of children they had carried, birthed, and nurtured. The domestic labor that enslaved women disproportionately performed brought them into close contact with slave-holding families and created complex relational dynamics that could sometimes allow enslaved women to exercise limited forms of influence, while also exposing them to constant supervision and to forms of emotional manipulation that supplemented physical coercion. The resistance strategies that enslaved women employed included abortion and infanticide as desperate measures to prevent children from being born into slavery, sexual refusal as a means of denying masters the satisfaction of their desires and the profit from children's labor, and the preservation of family and community bonds that slavery sought to destroy. The history of childhood under slavery reveals the ways that the institution's brutality extended to the youngest members of enslaved communities who were subjected to trauma, exploitation, and premature maturation into systems of forced labor. The children born into slavery inherited enslaved status from their mothers and became property from birth, subject to sale away from their families at any age. The childhood experiences of enslaved persons included witnessing violence against family members, performing labor appropriate to their age and strength from early ages, and receiving inadequate nutrition and medical care that contributed to high mortality rates. The education that enslaved children received was primarily vocational training in the tasks they would perform as adults, with literacy and formal schooling generally prohibited under slave codes that feared education would promote resistance. The psychological development of enslaved children occurred in contexts of oppression and violence that created lasting trauma, while also fostering resilience and the development of survival strategies. The family structures that enslaved persons created and maintained, despite slavery's assaults, represented important sources of support and resistance, providing emotional sustenance and practical assistance while preserving cultural traditions and social bonds. The marriages that enslaved persons formed lacked legal recognition under slave codes that denied slaves the capacity to enter contracts, but these unions were nonetheless meaningful relationships that partners worked to preserve despite the constant threat of separation through sale. The extended kinship networks that developed in slave communities provided systems of mutual aid and childcare that were essential for survival and that maintained connections across plantation boundaries through visits and communication. The transmission of cultural knowledge, religious traditions, and historical memory across generations occurred primarily within family contexts, where elders taught younger community members about their African heritage and their families' experiences under slavery. The naming practices that enslaved persons used reflected their determination to maintain family identities and connections, despite masters' attempts to erase individual and collective histories through the imposition of new names and the disruption of family units through sale. The role of religion in enslaved communities provided spiritual resources for enduring suffering, frameworks for understanding their condition and hoping for liberation, and organizational structures that enabled collective action. The Christianity that most enslaved persons in British colonies adopted was transformed through African spiritual traditions and the specific needs of enslaved communities, creating distinctive forms of religious expression that emphasized liberation themes and that provided emotional and social support. The spirituals that enslaved communities created combined Christian imagery with African musical forms and often contained coded messages about escape routes, warnings about danger, and expressions of hope for freedom that were comprehensible to initiated listeners while remaining obscure to masters. The religious meetings that brought enslaved persons together created spaces for community building and for the discussion of concerns that could not be safely addressed in the presence of white overseers, with some meetings serving as occasions for planning resistance or organizing escapes. The preachers who emerged in enslaved communities exercised leadership roles that extended beyond religious instruction to encompass counseling, conflict resolution, and sometimes the organization of resistance activities. The material culture that enslaved persons created and used provides archaeological and artifactual evidence of their lives, their resistance, and their cultural creativity. The pottery, tools, clothing, and personal items that enslaved persons made for their own use often combined African design elements with American materials and European techniques, creating syncretic cultural forms that reflected the complex blending that characterized enslaved communities. The archaeological excavation of slave quarters and the analysis of artifacts found at these sites have revealed aspects of enslaved persons' lives that written sources produced by masters often obscure, including evidence of independent economic activity, religious practices, and social relationships. The coins, beads, and other items that enslaved persons cached or wore as amulets suggest the continuation of African spiritual practices and the attribution of supernatural power to certain objects. The food remains found at slave quarter sites provide evidence of diet and of the supplementary hunting, fishing, and gathering that enslaved persons undertook to augment the inadequate rations that masters provided. The architecture of slave housing reflects both the minimal resources that masters devoted to slaves' living conditions and the efforts that enslaved persons made to create livable spaces within severe constraints. The transition from slavery to freedom in British territories after 1838 involved complex negotiations over labor conditions, land access, and the terms of economic relationships between former slaves and former masters. The freed persons who sought to establish independent livelihoods faced obstacles including lack of capital, planters' control of the best agricultural land, and colonial policies designed to force former slaves into wage labor on terms favorable to planters. The establishment of free villages and the purchase of land by former slaves who pooled their limited resources represented important achievements of autonomous organization and economic independence, though the obstacles to land ownership and the pressures of market forces limited the possibilities for complete economic autonomy. The wage labor that many former slaves performed on plantations occurred under conditions that preserved significant continuities with slavery, including low wages, harsh discipline, and the use of legal mechanisms like vagrancy laws to force labor. The migration of former slaves from plantations to towns and cities, or to territories where land was more available, represented efforts to escape plantation labor and create better lives, though urban areas and frontier regions presented their own challenges and forms of exploitation. The education that former slaves sought for themselves, and especially for their children, represented both a practical strategy for economic advancement and a symbolic assertion of full humanity that slavery had denied. With the establishment of schools in former slave communities representing important community achievements, despite the resistance of some whites who feared that educated blacks would refuse to accept subordinate positions. The long-term economic effects of slavery on freed persons included the lack of capital accumulation that resulted from generations of unpaid labor, the disruption of family structures and social institutions that slavery had caused, and the ongoing discrimination that limited opportunities and that preserved many of the social hierarchies that slavery had established. The intergenerational transmission of disadvantage meant that the children and grandchildren of formerly enslaved persons continued to face obstacles that derived from their ancestors' bondage, even as formal legal equality was gradually established. The psychological and cultural legacies of slavery included both the trauma that resulted from centuries of brutalization and the resilience, creativity, and resistance traditions that enslaved communities had developed. The memory of slavery among descendants of enslaved persons has been shaped by family stories, community traditions, and the broader cultural narratives that societies have constructed about the institution and its meanings. The tension between the desire to honor ancestors' suffering and resistance and the need to avoid being defined entirely by historic oppression has influenced how communities of African descent have engaged with slavery's soaps, history. The cultural production that has emerged from communities with roots in slavery includes literature, music, visual art, and other forms that draw on slavery's history while also asserting the humanity, creativity, and agency of those who endured it. The commemoration of slavery and its abolition has taken various forms, including the designation of memorial days, the establishment of museums and historic sites, the erection of monuments, and the incorporation of slavery's history into educational curricula and public discourse. The debates about how to commemorate slavery reflect differing views about what aspects of the history should be emphasized and what meanings should be drawn from it, with some approaches focusing on the suffering that slavery inflicted, while others emphasize the resistance that enslaved persons mounted, or the eventual achievement of freedom. The international dimensions of commemoration include UNESCO's designation of August 23rd as International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, marking the anniversary of the 1791 uprising in Haiti that began the Haitian Revolution, and efforts to create World Heritage Sites that recognize slavery's historic importance. The apologies for slavery that some governments and institutions have issued represent attempts to acknowledge historic wrongs and their ongoing effects, though the adequacy of such symbolic gestures without material redress remains contested. The Church of England's apology in 2020 for its historic involvement in slavery through its ownership of enslaved persons on Barbados plantations represented institutional recognition of complicity in the institution and of the moral obligations that such complicity creates. The questions about what forms of redress might be appropriate responses to slavery's historic injustices have generated extensive debate, encompassing arguments for financial reparations, investments in communities disadvantaged by slavery's legacies, educational programs that ensure accurate teaching of slavery's history, and symbolic recognitions of the wrongs that were committed. The practical challenges of designing and implementing reparations programs include questions about who would be eligible to receive compensation, who would bear the costs, how amounts would be calculated, and what mechanisms would ensure that reparations achieve their intended purposes. The moral arguments for reparations emphasize that the wealth extracted through slavery continues to benefit descendants of slaveholders, while descendants of enslaved persons continue to suffer disadvantages that derive from their ancestors' bondage, creating obligations of justice that transcend the passage of time. The arguments against reparations contend that the individuals who directly participated in slavery are long dead, that contemporary persons cannot be held responsible for their ancestors' actions, that the difficulties of identifying beneficiaries and determining appropriate compensation are insurmountable, and that reparations would be divisive and would perpetuate racial categorizations rather than promoting unity and forward-looking solutions. The comparative study of how different societies have addressed historic injustices, including slavery, provides examples of various approaches and their effects, with some contexts pursuing extensive reparations programs, while others have emphasized truth-telling, apology, and reconciliation processes without material compensation. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that addressed apartheid's injustices, offered a model of confronting historic wrongs through testimony and acknowledgement, rather than primarily through punishment, compensation. Though the adequacy of that approach for addressing slavery's legacies remains debated, the Holocaust reparations that Germany has paid to survivors and their descendants represent a different model involving substantial financial compensation alongside other forms of recognition and remembrance. Though the specific circumstances of the Holocaust and its more recent occurrence make direct comparisons with slavery complex, the study of slavery's history in England continues to evolve as new sources are discovered, new methodologies are developed, and new questions are asked that reflect contemporary concerns and interests. The digitization of archival records has made vast quantities of slavery-related documents accessible to researchers who can now analyze patterns across thousands of sources that would have been impractical to examine manually. The application of computational methods to questions about slavery's economics, demographics, and social patterns has enabled analyses of scales and complexities that were previously impossible, though such quantitative approaches must be balanced with attention to the qualitative dimensions of human experience that statistics cannot capture. The interdisciplinary study of slavery that brings together historians, economists, anthropologists, literary scholars, and researchers from other fields has enriched understanding by examining the institution from multiple perspectives and by integrating different types of evidence and analysis. The global history approaches that situate English slavery within broader Atlantic and world systems reveal connections and comparisons that national frameworks obscure, demonstrating how slavery in English contexts was part of larger patterns of exploitation and resistance that transcended particular imperial or national boundaries. The examination of slavery's cultural dimensions, including its representations in literature, art, and popular culture, has revealed how the institution shaped and was shaped by the imaginative and symbolic systems through which people understood their world. The analysis of pro-slavery arguments and anti-slavery discourse illuminates the ideological struggles through which slavery's legitimacy was contested and through which different visions of social order and human nature were articulated and debated. The recovery of enslaved persons' voices and perspectives through the analysis of slave narratives, court testimony, interviews with former slaves, and other sources that preserve their words has partially addressed the silences that result from the fact that most slavery-related sources were produced by slaveholders and other free persons. The attention to enslaved persons' agency and to the ways they shaped their own lives, despite the constraints that slavery imposed, has corrected earlier historical approaches that portrayed enslaved persons primarily as passive victims rather than as active participants in their own histories. The study of slavery's resistance has documented the many forms that opposition took and has analyzed the strategies, motivations, and effects of different types of resistance, from everyday non-cooperation to organized rebellion. The investigation of how enslaved persons created and maintained communities, families, and cultural traditions, despite slavery's assaults, has revealed the resilience and creativity that characterized enslaved populations and that enabled survival under conditions designed to break spirits and destroy human bonds. The examination of childhood, gender, labor, religion, family, and other specific dimensions of enslaved life has provided detailed understanding of how slavery functioned and how it affected different categories of enslaved persons in various ways. The history of slavery's abolition and of the political, economic, social, and cultural factors that contributed to the institution's ending has been extensively studied, with scholars analyzing the roles of economic change, political mobilization, ideological transformation, and slave resistance in bringing about emancipation. The historiographical debates about the relative importance of different factors in explaining abolition reflect broader disagreements about historical causation and about how to weigh material interests against ideological commitments, moral convictions. The emphasis that some scholars place on economic factors as driving forces behind abolition suggests that changes in production systems, labor markets, and capital accumulation patterns made slavery less profitable or less advantageous for dominant economic interests, creating material bases for political movements to end the institution. The attention that other scholars direct toward ideological and cultural changes emphasizes the emergence of new moral frameworks and political philosophies that made slavery increasingly difficult to defend in terms compatible with Enlightenment principles and emerging liberal values. The focus that some historians place on slave resistance as a crucial factor in abolition highlights the ways that enslaved persons' own actions raised the costs of maintaining slavery and demonstrated the impossibility of permanently individual of reason, suppressing the human desire for freedom. The recognition that abolition resulted from complex interactions among economic, ideological, political, and social factors rather than from any single cause reflects more sophisticated understanding of historical change as multiply, determined, and contingent, rather than following simple linear patterns or monocausal logics. The legacy of slavery for contemporary England includes ongoing debates about race relations, immigration, national identity, and the meanings of British history in an increasingly diverse society. The presence of substantial populations of African and Caribbean descent, whose ancestors were enslaved by British subjects, or who migrated from former slave colonies, has made slavery's history immediate and personal, rather than safely distant, creating pressure for fuller acknowledgement of the institution and its effects. The Black Lives Matter movement that gained prominence in Britain during 2020 renewed attention to slavery's legacies and to the monuments and institutions that celebrate figures who profited from slavery, with campaigns to remove statues of slave traders and to rename buildings and streets that honored persons involved in the slave trade. The toppling of the statue of slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol during protests in June 2020 represented a dramatic assertion that commemorating such figures was unacceptable and that the public landscape should reflect values incompatible with celebrating those who profited from human bondage. The debates about whether removing such monuments constituted erasing history or appropriately reconsidering what persons and events deserved commemoration revealed deep disagreements about how societies should relate to troubling aspects of their pasts. The argument that statues and other honors represent endorsements rather than neutral historical markers suggested that allowing them to remain conveyed approval of the honored person's actions, including their involvement in slavery. The counterclaim that removing monuments would eliminate important reminders of history and that all historical figures should be judged by their own time standards rather than contemporary values reflected concerns about presentism and about the implications of applying current moral standards retroactively. The compromise positions that have been proposed include adding contextualization that explains honored figures' involvement in slavery, relocating controversial monuments to museums where they can be presented with appropriate historical framing, or creating new monuments that honor enslaved persons and abolitionists to balance celebrations of slave traders. The teaching of slavery's history in British schools has become politically contentious, with debates about how much emphasis should be placed on Britain's role in slavery versus its leadership in abolition, whether teaching should emphasize slavery's evils or avoid creating guilt or resentment, and how to present complex historical realities to students of different ages. The development of curriculum, materials, and teaching resources that address slavery in historically accurate and pedagogically appropriate ways has engaged educators, historians, and community advocates in efforts to ensure that students learn this crucial history. The resistance from some political quarters to expanded teaching about slavery and empire reflects anxieties about national identity and concerns that emphasis on historic injustices undermines pride in British achievements, contributions. The argument that education should provide balanced perspectives that acknowledge both positive and negative aspects of history confronts questions about whether balance means equal time for different viewpoints, or whether historical accuracy requires proportionate attention to different aspects of the past. The research into slavery's history continues to produce new findings and interpretations that deepen understanding of the institution, its operations, its impacts, and its meanings. The discovery of previously unknown sources in archives, private collections, and unexpected locations provides fresh evidence that can answer old questions or open new lines of inquiry. The application of new analytical methods, including DNA analysis, isotope studies of skeletal remains, computational analysis of large datasets, and spatial analysis using geographic information systems, has enabled forms of investigation that earlier generations of historians could not pursue. The collaboration between historians and scholars from other disciplines, including archaeologists, geneticists, linguists, and digital humanists, has produced research that integrates different types of evidence and expertise to address complex questions about slavery's history. The engagement of descendant communities in research about slavery has brought new perspectives and priorities to historical investigation, while also raising ethical questions about ownership of history, appropriate methodologies, and the purposes that research should serve. The public history initiatives that have sought to make slavery's history accessible to broader audiences through museums, historic sites, digital projects, and community programs have created opportunities for people to engage with this history in personal and meaningful ways. The International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, that opened in 2007, provides comprehensive exhibitions about the slave trade, slavery's operations, its abolition, and its legacies, using artifacts, documents, multimedia presentations, and interactive displays to convey the history to diverse audiences. The museum's location in Liverpool, which was the centre of the British slave trade during the 18th century, gives particular resonance to its mission of acknowledging the city's role in slavery while educating about the institution and its continuing effects. The historic sites associated with slavery, including preserved plantation buildings, former slave quarters, and locations connected to the slave trade, provide tangible connections to the past that can make history concrete in ways that written sources alone cannot achieve. The interpretation of such sites raises questions about how to present spaces associated with suffering and exploitation in ways that honor those who endured slavery while providing historically accurate information and avoiding voyeuristic sensationalism. The memorial sites and monuments dedicated to enslaved persons and to slavery's victims create spaces for reflection and remembrance while asserting the importance of keeping this history in public consciousness. The Bussa Emancipation Statue in Barbados, erected in 1985, honors the leader of the 1816 slave rebellion and serves as a symbol of resistance and the struggle for freedom rather than passively accepting bondage. The memorial to the abolition of the slave trade in Lancaster, inaugurated in 2005, uses symbolic elements, including chains and shackles, alongside the representation of broken chains, to evoke both the suffering of slavery and the achievement of freedom. The debates about memorial design and the messages that public art should convey about slavery reflect differing views about whether the emphasis should be on suffering, resistance, freedom, or ongoing legacies. The artistic representations of slavery in literature, film, theatre, and visual arts have shaped public understanding of the institution, while also sometimes perpetuating misconceptions or romanticizing aspects of slavery in ways that obscure its brutality. The novels, films, and plays that have taken slavery as their subject vary enormously in their historical accuracy, their artistic quality, and their ethical frameworks, with some works providing powerful insights into slavery's realities, while others traffic in stereotypes or melodramatic simplifications. The challenges of representing slavery artistically include the risk of making suffering into entertainment, the difficulty of conveying slavery's psychological and social dimensions alongside its physical violence, and the ethical questions about who has authority to tell stories about slavery and for what purposes. The literature produced by writers of African descent has often engaged most powerfully with slavery's history and legacies, bringing perspectives rooted in community memory and in the ongoing effects of historic injustice. The contemporary relevance of slavery's history extends beyond academic interest or moral reflection to encompass practical questions about how societies address persistent inequalities and about what obligations historic injustices create for present generations. The wealth disparities between populations of European and African descent that exist in Britain and in former slave colonies reflect the historic theft of labor that slavery represented and the ongoing intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage that resulted from slavery and its aftermath. The educational attainment gaps, employment, discrimination, and disparate outcomes in criminal justice systems that affect communities of African descent connect to slavery's legacies through the racist ideologies that slavery cultivated and that have persisted in various forms. The health disparities that research has documented, including differential rates of certain diseases and different qualities of medical care received, reflect both genetic factors related to ancestral origins and social determinants of health that derive from historic and ongoing discrimination. The cultural expressions that communities of African descent have created, including music, literature, visual arts, and other forms, demonstrate creative vitality and cultural richness that slavery could not destroy, despite its attempts to erase African identities and to reduce enslaved persons to mere labor power. The intellectual traditions that have emerged from engagement with slavery's history, including Black political thought, Africana philosophy, and critical race theory, provide analytical frameworks for understanding how racial oppression operates and for imagining alternatives that would achieve genuine equality. The activism that has sought to address slavery's ongoing legacies has taken various forms, including legal challenges to discriminatory policies, political organizing to change laws and institutions, economic initiatives to build wealth in disadvantaged communities, educational programs to combat ignorance and prejudice, and cultural work to preserve memory and to assert the dignity and worth of those who endured slavery. The civil rights movements that have fought against racial discrimination and for equal treatment under law have drawn inspiration from slavery's history and from the resistance that enslaved persons mounted, seeing themselves as continuing struggles for freedom that began during slavery. The reparations movements that have demanded compensation for slavery's injustices have employed various strategies, including legal claims, political advocacy, moral arguments, and economic analysis to make the case that redress is both necessary and feasible. The Black Power movements and other forms of radical organizing have sometimes drawn on slavery's history to argue for fundamental transformations of social, economic, and political systems rather than merely seeking inclusion in existing structures. The scholarly study of slavery's modern legacies has examined how the institution's effects continue to shape contemporary realities through mechanisms including the intergenerational transmission of wealth and poverty, the perpetuation of racist ideologies and stereotypes, the structure of economic and political institutions, and the unequal distribution of opportunities and resources. The concept of structural racism that recognizes how racial inequality can be maintained through institutional practices and systemic arrangements, rather than only through individual prejudice or intentional discrimination, helps explain how slavery's effects persist long after formal legal equality has been established. The research into racial wealth gaps has demonstrated that disparities in asset ownership, home equity, business ownership, and inherited wealth reflect historic patterns of dispossession and exploitation that began with slavery and continued through subsequent forms of discrimination in lending, employment, housing, and education. The investigation of mass incarceration's racial dimensions has revealed disturbing continuities between slavery's use of black bodies for economic exploitation and profit, and contemporary prison labor systems that disproportionately confine people of color while extracting their labor for minimal or no compensation. The analysis of residential segregation and its effects has shown how the spatial separation of racial groups perpetuates inequality through differential access to quality schools, employment opportunities, healthcare, and other resources essential for social mobility. The examination of educational inequalities has documented how schools serving predominantly black and minority students receive less funding and fewer resources than schools in predominantly white areas, perpetuating achievement gaps that limit opportunities and that reproduce existing social hierarchies. The study of health disparities has identified multiple pathways through which slavery's legacies affect contemporary health outcomes, including the stress effects of ongoing discrimination, differential access to quality healthcare, environmental exposures related to residential segregation, and intergenerational transmission of health effects from maternal and early childhood experiences. The research into political representation and participation has analyzed how various mechanisms, including voter suppression tactics, gerrymandering, and the disenfranchisement of convicted felons, disproportionately affect communities of color in ways that limit their political power and their ability to address inequalities through democratic processes. The global dimensions of slavery's legacy include the ways that the institution shaped development patterns in Africa, the Americas, and Europe, with lasting effects on economic structures, political systems, and social relationships. The extraction of labor from Africa through the slave trade contributed to underdevelopment of African societies by removing millions of productive individuals and by distorting social and economic structures through the demands of slave, raiding and trading. The economies that developed in the Americas on the basis of slave labor created patterns of inequality and racial hierarchy that have persisted despite slavery's abolition and despite subsequent social and political changes. The wealth that slavery generated for European nations funded development of industrial capacity, infrastructure, cultural institutions, and military power that established European global dominance, and that continues to advantage European-descended populations. The contemporary debates about global inequality and development policy increasingly recognize slavery's role in creating the disparities between global North and South, and in establishing systems of extraction and exploitation that have evolved but not entirely disappeared. The calls for international cooperation to address slavery's legacies and to combat contemporary forms of slavery and forced labor reflect recognition that these issues transcend national boundaries and require coordinated responses. The historical consciousness of slavery that shapes how different populations understand their identities, their relationships to others, and their nation's pasts varies considerably across different communities and contexts. The descendants of enslaved persons who maintain connections to slavery's history through family stories, community traditions, and engagement with historical sources often have very different relationships to this past than do descendants of slaveholders or those whose ancestors were not directly involved. The national narratives that different countries construct about slavery reflect political choices about what aspects of the past to emphasize and how to frame historic events in relation to contemporary identities and values. The commemorative practices through which societies mark slavery's history create public memories that can either promote reconciliation and justice or perpetuate division and resentment, depending on how they acknowledge suffering, recognize resistance, distribute responsibility, and address ongoing effects. The educational approaches that different societies adopt for teaching slavery reflect philosophical commitments about the purposes of education and empirical judgments about how to convey difficult histories in developmentally appropriate and pedagogically effective ways. The legal frameworks that govern how slavery's history can be taught and discussed in some contexts reflect ongoing political struggles over control of historical narrative and over the implications that different versions of history carry for contemporary policy debates. The ethical obligations that slavery's history creates for contemporary individuals and institutions remain subject to debate, with different philosophical frameworks suggesting different conclusions about responsibility, obligation, and appropriate responses. The principle that those who benefit from historic injustice have obligations to contribute to redressing continuing effects of those injustices suggests that contemporary disparities related to slavery create claims for remedial action. The argument that individuals can only be held responsible for their own actions, rather than for what their ancestors did or what systems they inherit challenges, claims that contemporary persons have special obligations based on slavery's history. The distinction between collective responsibility for addressing unjust structures and individual moral guilt for past wrongs helps clarify that acknowledging slavery's legacies and working to address ongoing inequalities need not involve accepting personal blame for what historical figures did. The forward-looking orientation that focuses on creating just societies rather than settling accounts for past wrongs suggests that slavery's history should inform efforts to eliminate contemporary injustice rather than primarily prompting debates about historic responsibility. The balance between remembering the past and moving beyond it requires acknowledging historic wrongs and their continuing effects, while also avoiding the trap of letting history wholly determine present possibilities and future aspirations. The role of truth-telling about slavery's history in processes of reconciliation and justice depends on creating shared understanding of what occurred and on acknowledging the suffering and resistance of those who endured slavery. The recognition of enslaved persons' agency and humanity stands as crucial antidote to slavery's dehumanization and as essential element of any adequate reckoning with the institution's history. The preservation of slavery's historical record for future generations requires ongoing investment in archives, museums, educational programs, and research initiatives that ensure sources are maintained, interpreted, and made accessible. The digitization of slavery-related documents has created unprecedented access to primary sources, while also raising questions about digital preservation, ownership of digitized materials, and the implications of making disturbing content readily available. The ethical frameworks for research involving slavery's history must address questions about consent when studying persons who cannot give it, about appropriate treatment of human remains and artifacts associated with enslaved persons, and about the responsibilities that researchers have to descendant communities. The collaborative research models that involve descendant communities in defining research questions, interpreting findings, and determining how results are presented represent attempts to shift power dynamics that have historically excluded those most affected by research from controlling knowledge production about their own pasts. The repatriation of human remains and cultural objects taken from enslaved persons or their graves has become an important issue in museum ethics and archaeological practice, with recognition that such materials should be treated with respect and that descendant communities have legitimate interests in their disposition. The creation of new archives and collections that center the experiences and perspectives of enslaved persons, rather than primarily preserving slaveholders' documents, represents efforts to create more balanced historical records that make possible research attending to dimensions of slavery that traditional archives often obscure. The oral history projects that record interviews with descendants of enslaved persons who preserve family stories and memories create sources that complement documentary evidence while capturing perspectives and information that written records miss. The community history initiatives that engage local populations in researching and interpreting their own histories of slavery and its legacies create opportunities for people to connect personally with the past, while also contributing to historical knowledge. The genealogical research that individuals of African descent undertake to trace their family histories through and beyond slavery represents both personal quests for identity and roots and contributions to broader understanding of slavery's demographic and social patterns. The DNA testing that has become available to help individuals identify ancestral origins in Africa has created new possibilities for connection, while also raising questions about the meanings and limitations of genetic information for Oves. Understanding personal and collective identity. The reconciliation processes that some communities and institutions have undertaken to address slavery's legacies involve acknowledgement of past wrongs, efforts to understand their continuing effects, and commitments to work toward repair and justice. The apologies that churches, universities, corporations, and governments have issued for their historic involvement in slavery represent forms of recognition that slavery was wrong and that institutions benefiting from it bear some responsibility for addressing its legacies. The financial reparations that some institutions have committed to providing represent attempts to offer material redress for historic wrongs, though the amounts and forms of such compensation remain contested, and though institutional reparations do not address broader questions about societal obligations. The scholarship programs, community investments, and other forms of redress that institutions have undertaken as alternatives or supplements to direct financial payments represent attempts to channel resources in ways that address slavery's ongoing effects on educational, economic, and social opportunities. The difficulties of designing effective reparations programs that actually achieve their intended purposes without creating new problems or inequities have made implementation complex, even when philosophical justifications for reparations are accepted. The international human rights framework that has developed since the mid-20th century provides legal and moral principles that can be applied to slavery's history and legacies, with concepts like crimes against humanity offering frameworks for understanding slavery's legal and ethical status. The United Nations declarations and conventions that prohibit slavery and forced labor in all forms establish international standards that all nations are expected to uphold, though enforcement mechanisms remain limited and violations continue in various contexts. The International Criminal Court's jurisdiction over crimes against humanity could theoretically apply to contemporary slavery-like practices, though the court's focus on recent atrocities and its limited resources constrain its ability to address the full range of forced labor and human trafficking that persists globally. The contemporary forms of slavery and forced labor that continue to exist in various parts of the world demonstrate that the formal abolition of chattel slavery did not eliminate all forms of human bondage, and that ongoing vigilance and action remain necessary to combat exploitation. The estimated 20 to 40 million persons currently living in conditions of slavery or forced labor, according to international organizations, represent a continuing moral challenge. that demands attention and response from global community. The human trafficking that supplies forced labor for agriculture, manufacturing, domestic service, and commercial sexual exploitation operates through networks that span multiple countries and that exploit poverty, conflict, and weak governance to capture and control vulnerable persons. The debt bondage that traps workers in various industries, including brick kilns, garment factories, and agricultural estates, creates conditions where nominal freedom masks actual bondage, as workers find themselves unable to escape obligations to employers who control their labor and movements. The forced marriage that subjects women and girls to sexual slavery and domestic servitude represents another form of contemporary slavery that affects millions of persons globally and that reflects the continuation of patriarchal systems that treat women as property. The child labor that exploits millions of children in hazardous work that deprives them of education and normal development includes forms that constitute slavery or slavery-like practices under international legal definitions. The state-imposed forced labor that some authoritarian governments use to control populations, punish dissent, or pursue economic projects represents another category of contemporary slavery that affects substantial numbers of persons in several countries. The prison labor systems that operate in various countries, including in the United States, where the 13th Amendment's exception for persons convicted of crimes has enabled the continuation of forced labor in correctional contexts, raise questions about the boundaries between legitimate criminal punishment and slavery-like exploitation. The anti-slavery activism that addresses contemporary forms of bondage draws inspiration from historical abolition movements, while adapting strategies and tactics to current conditions, including the use of digital technologies for awareness, raising, survivor support, and coordination of advocacy efforts. The legislation that various countries have enacted to combat human trafficking and forced labor reflects growing recognition of contemporary slavery's scope and the need for legal frameworks that enable prosecution of traffickers while protecting victims. The supply chain transparency requirements that some jurisdictions have imposed on corporations represent attempts to use market mechanisms and consumer pressure to eliminate forced labor from production processes that supply goods to global markets. The certification systems and ethical sourcing initiatives that companies and industry groups have developed in response to concerns about forced labor vary considerably in their rigor and effectiveness, with some representing genuine efforts to eliminate exploitation, while others function primarily as public relations exercises that provide cover for continued abusive practices. The limitations of voluntary corporate responsibility initiatives have led to calls for stronger regulatory frameworks that would hold companies legally accountable for forced labor in their supply chains and that would provide meaningful penalties for violations. The challenges of identifying and documenting forced labor in complex global supply chains that involve multiple layers of subcontracting and that often operate in contexts where workers fear retaliation for reporting abuses make enforcement difficult even when legal frameworks exist. The coordination between governments, international organizations, civil society groups, and private sector actors that effective anti-slavery efforts require remains inadequate in many contexts, with fragmented approaches limiting the impact of individual initiatives. The historical perspective that examination of slavery's long history provides can inform contemporary anti-slavery efforts by revealing patterns in how systems of exploitation develop and persist, how resistance emerges and succeeds or fails, and how social change processes unfold. The recognition that earlier abolition movements succeeded through combinations of moral argument, political organizing, economic pressure, and slave resistance suggests strategies that remain relevant for contemporary contexts, while also acknowledging significant differences between historical slavery and current forms of bondage. The awareness that slavery's formal abolition did not eliminate racist ideologies or ensure genuine equality warns against assuming that legal changes alone will suffice to address contemporary slavery and its effects without sustained attention to underlying social, economic, and cultural factors that enable exploitation. The understanding that slavery's legacies persisted for generations after abolition through new forms of discrimination and exploitation should inform expectations about the long-term commitments necessary to address contemporary slavery's effects and to prevent new systems of bondage from emerging to replace those that are eliminated. The study of slavery's history thus serves not only to satisfy historical curiosity or to fulfill obligations to remember past injustices, but also to provide knowledge relevant to ongoing struggles for justice and human dignity in contexts where exploitation and bondage persist in various forms. The ethical imperative to confront slavery's history honestly emerges from the recognition that ignoring or minimizing past wrongs perpetuates injustice, by obscuring the sources of present inequalities, and by denying the experiences and suffering of those who endured slavery. The educational responsibility to teach slavery's history accurately reflects the understanding that historical knowledge is essential for informed citizenship and for the development of critical thinking capacities that enable individuals to analyze social systems and to recognize injustice in its various manifestations. The commemorative obligation to remember slavery's victims and to honor those who resisted reflects the moral principle that persons who suffered and died deserve recognition, and that their struggles for freedom should be acknowledged and celebrated. The reparative duty to address slavery's continuing effects derives from principles of justice that hold that beneficiaries of wrongdoing have obligations to contribute to remedying the harms that generated their advantages. The scholarly commitment to continue researching slavery's history reflects the recognition that historical understanding is never complete, and that new questions, sources, and methods continually open possibilities for deeper and more nuanced comprehension of the past. The political necessity of grappling with slavery's legacy emerges from the reality that societies cannot achieve genuine reconciliation or justice without confronting the historic wrongs that have shaped present conditions, and that continue to divide populations along lines that slavery established or reinforced. The cultural imperative to engage with slavery's history through literature, art, and public memory reflects the understanding that historical consciousness is constructed through multiple forms of representation, and that artistic expressions can convey dimensions of experience that purely factual accounts cannot capture. The personal relevance of slavery's history for individuals whose ancestors were enslaved or who benefited from slavery creates particular responsibilities to engage with the past in ways that acknowledge its ongoing effects on identity, opportunity, and life circumstances. The universal significance of slavery's history extends beyond those directly connected through ancestry to encompass all persons who live in societies shaped by the institution and who have stakes in addressing its legacies. The complexity of slavery's history resists simplification into morality tales with clear heroes and villains, requiring instead nuanced engagement with the ways that ordinary persons participated in extraordinary evil and with the structural forces that made slavery seem natural or inevitable to contemporaries who should have recognized its injustice. The discomfort that slavery's history provokes in persons who identify with slave-holding societies or who benefit from slavery's legacies should not be avoided, but rather embraced as appropriate response to genuine moral wrongs that demand acknowledgement and redress. The hope that engagement with slavery's history can generate emerges from recognition that human societies have proven capable of confronting and abolishing institutions that once seemed permanent, and that moral progress, though neither inevitable nor irreversible, remains possible through sustained effort and commitment. The connections between slavery's history and contemporary struggles for racial justice become apparent through examination of how the racist ideologies that justified slavery have persisted in modified forms, and how the economic inequalities that slavery created have been perpetuated through subsequent discriminatory policies and practices. The relevance of slavery's history to debates about immigration, citizenship, and national identity emerges from the ways that the institution shaped definitions of who belonged to the national community and what rights different categories of persons could claim. The importance of slavery's history for understanding the development of capitalism, industrialization, and global economic systems reflects the institution's centrality to processes of capital accumulation, market development, and the creation of production systems that generated unprecedented wealth for some while immiserating millions of others. The significance of slavery's history for comprehending the formation of modern race concepts and racial hierarchies lies in the ways that the institution both reflected and reinforced ideas about inherent differences between human populations that were used to justify exploitation. The necessity of slavery's history for grasping the origins and development of resistance movements, revolutionary struggles, and campaigns for human rights becomes clear through examination of how enslaved persons' fights for freedom inspired and informed subsequent liberation movements. The value of slavery's history for appreciating the resilience, creativity, and cultural achievements of enslaved communities and their descendants lies in recognition that slavery could not destroy human capacities for meaning-making, relationship building, and artistic expression, despite its brutal attempts to reduce persons to mere instruments of labor. The insights that slavery's history offers into the psychology of oppression and resistance inform understanding of how people maintain humanity and dignity in dehumanizing circumstances and how they mobilize courage to challenge overwhelming power. The lessons that slavery's history teaches about the dangers of unchecked power, the corruption that absolute authority breeds, and the necessity of institutional constraints and moral principles to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable populations remain relevant for contemporary political arrangements. The warnings that slavery's history provides about the capacity of economic interests to override moral considerations and about the ideological distortions that powerful groups generate to justify practices that benefit them at others' expense speak to ongoing dynamics in multiple spheres. The evidence that slavery's history supplies regarding the possibilities for ordinary persons to become complicit in great evils through their participation in unjust systems should prompt reflection about contemporary complicity, exploitation, and about responsibilities to examine and challenge unjust structures. The inspiration that slavery's history offers through examples of resistance, solidarity, and the gradual achievement of freedom despite tremendous obstacles provides encouragement for continued struggles against injustice in various forms. The humility that slavery's history should instill emerges from recognition of how thoroughly the institution was integrated into societies that considered themselves civilized and moral, and from awareness of how difficult it was for contemporaries to recognize and challenge practices that later generations would see as obviously wrong. The determination that slavery's history should strengthen derives from understanding that abolition resulted from sustained effort by people who refused to accept that an entrenched institution was inevitable and who persisted despite repeated setbacks and defeats. The wisdom that slavery's history can impart involves understanding that legal changes, while necessary, are insufficient to eliminate injustice without broader transformations of social relationships, economic structures, cultural attitudes, and political arrangements. The empathy that slavery's history should cultivate emerges from imaginative engagement with the experiences of those who suffered under the institution and with the struggles of those who fought to end it. The critical consciousness that slavery's history should develop involves capacity to recognize how power operates through multiple mechanisms, including violence, law, ideology, and economic structures, and to identify contemporary analogues of historical injustices. The commitment to justice that slavery's history should inspire derives from recognition that the institution's effects persist and that addressing its legacies requires ongoing action rather than merely acknowledging past wrongs. The global perspective that slavery's history demands emerges from recognition that the institution operated through transnational networks and that its effects shape development patterns across multiple continents in ways that continue to influence international relations and global inequalities. The long-term view that slavery's history requires involves understanding that institutions and their effects unfold over centuries, and that the timescales relevant to assessing historical developments and their consequences extend far beyond individual lifetimes or even multiple generations. The systemic analysis that slavery's history necessitates focuses attention on how various elements of social organization, including economic arrangements, legal frameworks, political structures, cultural systems, and ideological formations interact to create and sustain institutions that distribute power and resources unequally. The intersectional understanding that slavery's history promotes recognizes how multiple forms of oppression, based on race, class, gender, and other categories operated simultaneously and reinforced each other in ways that produced particular vulnerabilities and specific forms of exploitation for differently positioned persons. The historical specificity that careful study of slavery demands resists the temptation to treat the institution as monolithic across time and space, instead attending to the significant variations in slavery's forms, operations, and effects in different contexts, while also identifying common features that characterize slavery as a general category of human bondage. The comparative perspective that slavery's history enables allows for analysis of similarities and differences between slavery and other forms of coerced labor and exploitation, illuminating what was distinctive about chattel slavery while also revealing continuities with other systems of domination and extraction. The interdisciplinary approach that adequate engagement with slavery's history requires brings together insights from history, economics, sociology, anthropology, literary studies, legal scholarship, and other fields to build comprehensive understanding of the institution's multiple dimensions and effects. The methodological sophistication that contemporary slavery scholarship employs reflects the development of new techniques for analyzing sources, the application of quantitative methods to questions about slavery's economics and demographics, and the use of various forms of evidence, including documents, artifacts, oral histories, and environmental data. The ethical awareness that research on slavery demands involves careful consideration of how to study and represent the experiences of enslaved persons respectfully, while producing knowledge that serves justice rather than merely satisfying curiosity or advancing academic careers. The political consciousness that engagement with slavery's history should develop recognizes that knowledge production about the past is never neutral, and that different interpretations of slavery's history carry different implications for contemporary politics and for debates about how to address ongoing inequalities. The theoretical frameworks that scholars employ in studying slavery's history shape what questions are asked, what evidence is deemed relevant, and what conclusions are reached, with different theoretical commitments producing different emphases and interpretations. The narrative choices that historians make in constructing accounts of slavery's history determine which aspects of the past receive attention and how events are implotted into stories with particular structures, rhythms, and meanings. The language that is used to describe and discuss slavery matters significantly, with terms like enslaved person rather than slave, emphasizing the humanity of those in bondage and the fact that slavery was a condition imposed upon them rather than an essential identity. The visual representations of slavery in museums, monuments, and educational materials shape public understanding of the institution and influence emotional responses that affect political attitudes and policy preferences. The digital technologies that increasingly mediate engagement with slavery's history create new possibilities for access and interaction, while also raising questions about how screen-based encounters with the past differ from physical engagement with historic sites, artifacts, and documents. The public discourse about slavery that occurs through media, political debate, educational institutions, and community conversations shapes collective memory and influences how societies understand their obligations regarding slavery's legacies. The private conversations within families about slavery's history affect how individuals understand their identities and their relationships to the past, with different families emphasizing different aspects of history and drawing different lessons from ancestral experiences. The silences about slavery in contexts where the topic is avoided or minimized reflect the discomfort that the history provokes and the political stakes involved in how it is remembered and discussed. The contestation over slavery's history that occurs through competing narratives and conflicting interpretations demonstrates the ongoing relevance of the past for present concerns and the ways that historical understanding remains subject to negotiation and revision. The evolution of slavery scholarship over time reflects changing social contexts, methodological developments, expanding source bases, and shifting theoretical frameworks that continually reshape historical understanding. The archival work that historians continue to undertake in discovering, preserving, and interpreting sources related to slavery's history ensures that new evidence becomes available to address questions that earlier generations could not answer satisfactorily. The collaborative efforts that bring together scholars, community members, educators, museum professionals, and others in examining slavery's history create opportunities for more comprehensive and socially engaged historical work. The international dimensions of slavery scholarship involve the exchange of ideas and methods across national boundaries, and the development of comparative perspectives that situate particular instances of slavery within broader global patterns. The institutional support that universities, archives, museums, funding agencies, and other organizations provide for slavery research enables the sustained scholarly attention that the topic's complexity requires and that generates cumulative knowledge, advancing understanding. The teaching of slavery's history at various educational levels, from primary school through university, creates opportunities to convey knowledge to successive generations, while also posing pedagogical challenges about how to present disturbing material in age-appropriate ways that promote learning rather than merely shocking or disturbing students. The public programs that museums, historic sites, and community organizations offer about slavery's history serve diverse audiences with varying levels of prior knowledge and different relationships to the subject matter, requiring flexible approaches that can engage multiple constituencies. The media representations of slavery in documentaries, dramatic films, television programs, and other formats reach vast audiences and significantly shape popular understanding, making critical evaluation of such representations important for assessing their accuracy and their effects on public consciousness. The literary engagements with slavery's history by novelists, poets, playwrights, and other creative writers produce works that explore the emotional and psychological dimensions of slavery in ways that complement but differ from scholarly historical writing, using imagination to render experiences that documents can only partially convey. The artistic responses to slavery's history through visual arts, music, performance, and other creative forms express meanings and provoke responses that verbal language alone cannot achieve, contributing to collective memory and understanding through aesthetic rather than purely discursive means. The memorialization practices that create physical markers of slavery's history in landscapes and built environments make the past visible in ways that influence how people experience and understand the spaces they inhabit. The tourism that develops around slavery-related sites creates economic incentives for preservation and interpretation, while also raising questions about the ethics of making sites of suffering into attractions, and about how commercial considerations affect historical presentation. The genealogical research that connects individuals to slavery's history through family trees and ancestor identification creates personal stakes in the past that can motivate deeper engagement, while also sometimes producing reductive understandings that emphasize individual stories at the expense of structural analysis. The DNA testing that offers to connect people to ancestral origins provides genetic information that has uncertain relationships to the cultural identities and historical experiences that matter most for understanding slavery's legacies. The digital humanities projects that apply computational methods to slavery's history enable large-scale analysis of patterns in slave trading, plantation records, runaway advertisements, and other sources, while also raising methodological questions about what forms of understanding quantitative approaches can and cannot generate. The mapping projects that visualize slavery's geographic dimensions through spatial analysis and cartographic representation reveal patterns of slave trading, plantation development, and the forced migrations that slavery entailed. The database initiatives that aggregate information about enslaved persons, slave voyages, plantation operations, and other aspects of slavery create research infrastructure that makes possible investigations that individual scholars working alone could not pursue. The crowdsourcing efforts that engage public participation in transcribing documents, identifying persons in records, and contributing local knowledge to slavery research projects democratize historical work, while also requiring quality control mechanisms to ensure accuracy. The repatriation debates about whether materials related to slavery should be returned to communities of origin or descendant populations raise questions about ownership, custody, and the politics of cultural property. The preservation challenges that confront institutions holding slavery-related materials include the physical deterioration of documents and artifacts, the need for climate-controlled storage, and the costs of conservation work necessary to maintain collections for future use. The access issues that affect slavery research include restrictions on some materials due to privacy concerns or donor agreements, the costs of visiting archives and obtaining reproductions, and the linguistic barriers that limit who can work with sources in particular languages. The digitization projects that make slavery sources available online have democratized access in important ways, while also creating digital divides that privilege those with internet access and technological literacy. The interpretive work that contextualization requires for understanding slavery sources demands expertise in historical methods, knowledge of the periods and places where sources originated, and critical awareness of the perspectives and biases that shaped source creation. The translation work necessary for sources in languages other than English opens possibilities for comparative research, while also requiring attention to how linguistic choices affect meaning and interpretation. The collaboration across language communities that comparative slavery research requires creates opportunities for international scholarly exchange, while also presenting logistical and communication challenges. The synthesis of knowledge about slavery's history that textbooks, reference works, and survey histories attempt faces the difficulty of distilling vast and complex subject matter into manageable presentations without oversimplifying or distorting. The specialized studies that focus on particular aspects of slavery's history in specific contexts provide detailed understanding that general works cannot achieve, while sometimes losing sight of broader patterns and connections. The balance between breadth and depth that slavery scholarship must navigate involves choices about whether to pursue comprehensive coverage or intensive analysis, and about how to connect specific findings to larger interpretive frameworks. The contribution that slavery's history makes to general historical understanding extends beyond knowledge of the institution itself to inform comprehension of economic development, political formations, cultural change, and social dynamics across multiple contexts and time periods. The significance of slavery's history for the present lies not in providing simple lessons or direct analogies, but in deepening understanding of how injustice operates, how resistance emerges, how change occurs, and how past wrongs shape present conditions in ways that create ongoing obligations to pursue justice and to resist exploitation in its various forms. The study of slavery's history in England thus encompasses not merely a particular national experience, but part of a global phenomenon that shaped the modern world and whose legacies continue to demand attention, reflection, and action from all who inherit the world that slavery helped create.